My husband set the divorce papers on the bathroom counter while I was still peeling the last adhesive patches from my abdomen. He never looked down, not at the bruises scattered across my stomach after weeks of hormone medication, blood draws, and injection after injection. Not at my hands, which were still trembling from pain and lack of sleep. He only looked in the mirror and adjusted the collar of his shirt, as if he were getting ready to walk into an ordinary meeting. My name is Rachel Morgan. I am 34 years old and work as a health data analyst. I had been married to Ethan for 8 years and had spent the last 5 of them undergoing fertility treatment. That morning, I believed I had just lost everything. What I did not know was that Ethan believed an electronic record could turn something false into something true, and he had forgotten that my life's work was reading records. Our final cycle, the one we both called our last try, produced 3 embryos. I still remember exactly how I felt when I heard that number, almost grateful, after 6 egg retrieval cycles and 7 failed embryo transfers. 3 embryos, 3 chances, enough for me to let myself hope one more time. 3 days earlier, Novalife had confirmed that the first embryo, C16, had failed to implant. The other 2, C17 and C18, were still listed as being in storage. That was what I believed until Ethan set the papers on the counter. If someone you trusted more than anyone has ever made you doubt yourself, tell me where you're watching from. Because this was only Ethan's first lie. "The treatment is over, Rachel," Ethan said, his voice so calm that it took me several seconds to understand what he meant. "There is nothing left to save." I pulled my shirt down over the bruises and turned to look at him. "We still have 2 embryos," I said. "C17 and C18. You know that." Ethan was silent for a beat, just long enough for me to realize he had prepared his answer in advance. "They both stopped developing," he said. "The clinic confirmed it. There are no viable embryos left." I gripped the edge of the counter and tried to understand his words the way I would analyze an anomalous data point. But in that moment, I was not an analyst. I was only a woman who had just been told that 5 years of treatment had left her with no chances at all. "Why didn't anyone call me?" I asked. "Dr. Sloan called me last night." "Why would he call you? I'm the patient." "Because you were unstable after the failed transfer." I looked at Ethan. "I was unstable?" "You cried in the car for almost an hour." "My embryo didn't implant." Ethan did not answer. Instead, he did something I do not think I will ever forget, even years later. He told me Madison was pregnant. Madison Cole, 28, Novalife's director of patient relations, the woman who had personally stepped out of reception to call my name every time I came in, the woman who had handed me a cup of warm water while I waited for blood test results, her face full of sympathy. 14 weeks, Ethan said. 14 weeks. That meant it had started before my CDAC size transfer. It meant that while I was lying on the procedure table, while I was taking hormone medication on schedule and waiting for the result, the man I had married knew another pregnancy was growing somewhere outside our marriage. "It happened naturally, Rachel," he continued, and now his voice carried something I had never heard in all 8 years of our marriage: relief. "No medication, no clinic, no procedure at all. Do you understand what that means?" I did. Ethan wanted me to believe those failures had not come from probability or the limits of medicine. After 6 egg retrieval cycles, 7 embryo transfers, and hundreds of injections, he still wanted me to believe the only problem was my body. The worst part was not that he said it. The worst part was that in that moment, I believed him. I stood in the bathroom of my own home, my body still aching from the final round of treatment, and the first feeling that rose inside me was not anger. It was shame. I was so ashamed I could barely breathe. In that moment, I believed I had taken 5 years from Ethan because I could not give him a child. 24 hours, Ethan said, tapping one finger against the papers on the counter. "By this time tomorrow, I want you out of the house." He turned toward the door, then he stopped with one hand on the frame. Sign the embryo disposition form too, Rachel. There is no reason for you to keep something that is already dead. I sat on the bedroom floor for nearly an hour after Ethan left the bathroom, my back against the foot of the bed. The divorce papers were still on the counter where he had left them. I did not cry. I only sat there and began doing what I always did whenever something did not add up. I went back to the beginning. 6 egg retrieval cycles, 7 embryo transfers, 5 years. During that time, I only missed work on the days when procedures required me to be at the clinic. I worked full-time for a health data analytics company. Every workday was arranged around injections, follicle monitoring ultrasounds, and 6 in the morning blood draws. I scheduled the earliest appointments of the day so I could make it back to the office before the 9 o'clock meeting. I turned down 2 promotions because I did not want to take on more responsibility during treatment. And I did all of it quietly, because I believed that was my contribution to an effort we were making together. Ethan never moved his schedule. He came to the clinic, yes, but he always sat in the farthest row of the waiting area with his eyes fixed on his phone. Once, when I came out of the procedure room still unsteady on my feet, I saw him smiling at something on the screen. Ethan put the phone away the moment he saw me. I told myself he had received good news at work. After everything we were going through, I thought Ethan deserved a moment of relief too. I made excuses for him many times during those years. That was what I understood most clearly as I sat on the floor that morning. Ethan controlled the financial side of the treatment. He was Chief Financial Officer of Nova Life Management Services, the entity responsible for the Nova Life Network's finances and non-clinical operations. So it had once seemed entirely reasonable for Ethan to handle the payments, bills, and administrative paperwork. Ethan kept every bill. I did not know exactly how much we had spent. Every time I asked, he said money was not the issue, that I only needed to focus on staying healthy, and I was always grateful for that. Judith, my mother-in-law, never used crude words. She was honorary chair of the Nova Life Family Foundation and chose her language so carefully that no one could point to a single openly insulting sentence. But at every family dinner, there was always some remark delivered softly, usually while Judith was pouring tea or serving dessert. "This family needs an heir, Ethan," she would say without looking at me. Or, "Some people belong in a family's future, and some people do not. It is no one's fault." She always ended with a sentence like that. It sounded compassionate, but all it really did was reinforce what I had begun to believe. I was the only person who needed to be replaced. And then there were the forms. Throughout treatment, I signed many electronic forms. That is normal for anyone who has undergone fertility treatment: procedure consent, anesthesia consent, storage consent, contact information updates. But there was one detail whose true meaning I did not understand until much later. Ethan would often hold out his phone and say the system needed a quick verification. "It's easier if the verification code goes to my phone," he once said in a completely ordinary voice. "When the system asks for it, I'll read it back to you. You can't hold your phone while you're in recovery." I agreed. Not once, but many times over many years. I worked with health data every day. I understood how system logs and 2-factor authentication worked. I also knew that contact information was one of the most important fields in a patient record. And yet I never questioned why verification codes for my record were being sent to Ethan's phone. I believed he was helping. I was often tired, in pain, and still under the effects of medication while lying in recovery. Back then, I never imagined my husband had a reason to control my records. But what treatment cost me most was not money or my career. It was trust in my own perception. After every failed transfer, I became a little more certain that the problem was me, and Ethan was always there at exactly the right moment to reinforce that belief, never by shouting, but with words so gentle that I could not argue against them. "You're becoming obsessed with this, Rachel. You're remembering it wrong. The doctor never said that." "I'm worried about you. You're not as stable as you used to be." By the 5th failure, I had started recording everything on my phone because I no longer trusted my memory. By the 6th, I stopped even taking notes. Every time I reread them, I saw only proof of what Ethan kept telling me, that I was clinging to something everyone else had already let go. Sitting on the bedroom floor that morning, I realized something chilling. I had never doubted Ethan even once. Not because he was that good at hiding things, but because he had spent all that time teaching me that the only person in that house who deserved to be doubted was me. Eventually, I stood up and went back to the bathroom. The papers were still on the counter. I opened them for the first time. The divorce petition was on top. Beneath it was an inventory of assets and provisions concerning the house, our joint accounts, and legal expenses. Then came a separate 4-page document. Voluntary relinquishment of rights to remaining stored reproductive material. I read the title twice. Ethan had said sedated and sedated were dead. But the form in front of me asked me to surrender every right connected to the embryos that remained. If there was truly nothing left to save, I did not understand why Ethan needed my signature so urgently. I carried that form downstairs, intending to ask Ethan one question. If C-17 and C-18 were dead, why did I still have to relinquish my rights to them? But I never reached that question, because the moment I stepped off the last stair, I saw Madison Cole standing in the middle of my living room, holding a fan deck of paint samples, her head tilted slightly as if she were deciding between 2 shades of blue. She did not startle when she saw me. That was the first detail that made me stop. In the corner of the room, 3 cardboard boxes had been sealed and neatly taped shut. I recognized my things immediately. The books from the bottom shelf, the framed wedding photo that had sat on the console table, and the wool shawl I always kept on the armchair. Someone had taken the time to sort my life into 3 boxes, and that person was not me. Madison was wearing my gray wool coat. "Ethan said you weren't coming back," she said when she noticed me looking at the coat. There was no malice in her voice, which somehow made the words even more upsetting. "I thought you'd already taken everything you needed." Her stomach was visibly rounded beneath the coat. 14 weeks, just as Ethan had said. "How long have you had a key to this house?" I asked. Madison set the paint samples on the table as naturally as if she were standing in her own home. "Since November," she said. "Ethan said everything was almost finished. The divorce was only a formality. He told me I didn't have to be discreet anymore." November. By then, the 3 embryos from my final cycle had already been created and entered into Novolife's system. Ethan was still driving me to the clinic, still sitting outside the waiting area, still telling me we were trying together. Meanwhile, he had given Madison a key to our house. "I'm choosing a color for the little room at the end of the hall," she said, looking back down at the paint samples. "Ethan likes blue-gray." That was the room I had kept empty for 5 years, afraid to buy anything for it, because every failure meant packing away whatever I had dared to buy. I said nothing about the room. Instead, I asked, "Madison, how much do you know about my treatment?" For the first time, she paused, not because she was confused, but because she seemed to be deciding how much to answer. "I'm Nova Life's Director of Patient Relations," she said. "I can see the schedules of patients within my area of responsibility. That's my job." But schedules were not what Madison was talking about, and both of us knew it. In only a few sentences, Madison mentioned my July cycle, the time my protocol had to be changed, and the number of mature follicles Dr. Sloan had read aloud during a private consultation. I worked with health data. I knew exactly where the boundary of need to know lay. A director of patient relations might know what time my appointment was. She had no reason to know the number of mature follicles from my 4th cycle. At that moment, Ethan came in from the kitchen holding a cup of coffee. He stopped when he saw both of us. Madison turned toward Ethan. Perhaps because she believed everything had already been settled, she continued in an almost gentle voice, as though she were trying to comfort me. "Rachel, I know you've been through so many rounds, but at least one of them produced something worthwhile." "Madison." Ethan cut her off. His voice was sharper than any reaction I had heard from him in 8 years of marriage. The entire room was silent for about 2 seconds. At the time, I did not understand what Madison meant. I only thought she was trying to comfort me badly. But Ethan cut her off too quickly. It was the reflex of a man who had just heard his secret almost spoken aloud. I recorded the sentence in my mind, word for word, along with the look Ethan gave Madison immediately afterward. Madison picked up the glass of water on the table. When she reached for it, the sleeve of my coat slid back slightly. On her wrist was a Nova Life patient identification band, the thin plastic kind the clinic put on patients before they entered a procedure room. I had worn one 7 times in 5 years, enough to recognize it from 10 feet away. Madison immediately pulled the sleeve down to cover it, but I had already seen the date printed on the band. Mid-October. Exactly when a 14-week pregnancy would have begun. The wristband did not prove that Madison was pregnant with my embryo. It also did not tell me what procedure she had undergone at Nova Life. But it was enough to collapse the story Ethan had just told me. No medication. No clinic. No procedure at all. Madison had entered Nova Life's procedure area at exactly the time her pregnancy began. And Ethan had lied to me about it. I left the living room without saying another word to Madison, went upstairs to the bedroom, and did the first thing my professional instincts told me to do. I opened the banking app. Our joint account had exactly $412 left. I refreshed the screen 3 times, not because I thought I had read it wrong, but because my brain needed a few seconds to accept the number. Only 3 days earlier, the account still held enough to cover 2 months of living expenses for both of us. Nearly the entire balance had been moved out in 2 transfers, both made the previous afternoon while I was resting upstairs and believing I was only recovering from a failed treatment cycle. My authorized user credit card had been canceled. I discovered that when I tried to pay a small bill, and the system said the card was no longer active. The savings account dedicated to treatment, the one we had opened 5 years earlier, and that I had contributed to every month from my own salary, had been transferred into a new account in Ethan Morgan's name alone. My personal account was untouched. $2,800. That was everything I could access immediately. I sat staring at the number and calculated quickly in my head. $2,800 was enough to rent temporary housing for about a month, or enough to pay for an initial consultation with an attorney. Not enough for both. Ethan had not taken every last thing I had. He did not need to. He had only left me enough so I could not survive and fight back at the same time. Then my phone vibrated. It was an email from my company's human resources department, sent at 9:23 that morning. The message was brief and entirely procedural. My system access had been temporarily suspended while the company reviewed a security complaint submitted by a third party. I was instructed not to log into any internal system until further notice. That third party was Nova Life Management Services. I read the description of the complaint twice, and by the second time, my hands had begun to go cold. It accused me of improperly accessing Nova Life system data by exploiting my expertise in health data analytics. I understood immediately why Ethan had chosen that accusation. 2 years earlier, when Nova Life upgraded its patient record management system, Ethan had asked me to review a technical report that contained no patient identifying information. He said he did not understand the terminology and needed someone who knew how to read system logs to explain it. I showed Ethan how to read timestamps, distinguish access logs from modification logs, and identify a record that had been altered after it was signed. At the time, I thought I was only helping my husband do his job better. Now Ethan was using that same event to build a different story. If I found anything unusual in my own records, he could say his unstable, estranged wife had the technical knowledge to tamper with the data. Ethan was not only taking my money, he was putting the label stolen data on every piece of evidence I might find later. Once I understood Ethan's purpose, I knew what I had to do next. I did not touch anything belonging to Nova Life. Not a file, not an internal document, not a single login. I opened my personal laptop and checked the downloads folder and browser history. I did not delete or alter anything. I only confirmed that the computer contained no Nova Life data, then closed it. When I left that house, I took only my personal laptop, enough clothes for 2 weeks, my identification, and every legal document that belonged to me. Among them was the treatment file I had printed and kept for 5 years, the kind of record any patient had the right to possess. I also took the divorce papers and the form asking me to relinquish my rights to the remaining embryos. I signed nothing. I only folded the papers, put them in my bag, and zipped it shut. Ethan stood in the hallway while I pulled my suitcase toward the door. He did not help or stop me. He only watched with the expression of a man waiting for confirmation that everything had gone according to plan. "You'll be fine, Rachel," he said. "Just sign the papers and everything will be easier for both of us." I did not answer. I drove out of that neighborhood near noon and headed north toward Lake County, where a small lakeside house had been left to me by my late aunt 4 years earlier. It was the only property solely in my name. Ethan had never cared about the house because it was too small and too remote to have value in his eyes. About an hour into the drive, the pain began. At first, it was only the tight, aching sensation I had experienced after hormone treatments. But by the time the dashboard clock reached 2 in the afternoon, it had become a completely different kind of pain. Deeper, more intense. It pulled from my lower abdomen into both sides of my hips. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and told myself I had only 40 minutes left. But the next wave of pain made me unsure I could remain conscious that long. I made it to the lake house at around 3 in the afternoon. It was smaller than I remembered, a one-story wooden house about 100 feet from the water, its porch covered with dry leaves from the previous season. The heating system worked so poorly that it took almost half an hour for the living room to warm even slightly. The kitchen cabinet held only an expired box of tea, 2 cans of soup, and a bag of rice I was not sure was still safe to eat. I sat in the armchair covered with a drop cloth and told myself that if I rested for a while and drank some water, the pain would ease the way it had before. But it did not ease. By around 5 that evening, it hurt to take a deep breath. My abdomen was so tight that even a light touch caused pain, and every time I stood up, the room tilted for several seconds before settling again. I decided to step onto the porch for cold air, thinking perhaps I was only feeling trapped in the poorly ventilated room. I made it 3 steps outside before everything went black. The next thing I remember was a man's voice, not loud and not panicked, only speaking each word very clearly beside me. "Can you still hear me? Don't try to sit up." I opened my eyes and saw a man around 40, wearing a work jacket, kneeling on one knee beside me on the porch. He was not touching me. That was the first thing I registered, even half-conscious. He kept his distance and only spoke. "I was checking the water line between the 2 houses," he said. "I've called 911. The ambulance should be here in about 12 minutes. Can you tell me what treatment you've had recently?" I could only say that I had recently undergone hormone treatment and an embryo transfer. He nodded and asked nothing else. He did not ask why I was alone. He did not ask where my husband was. He did not ask what I was running from. When the ambulance arrived, the man gave a brief professional report. When he had found me, the condition of my breathing, my level of consciousness, and the fact that I had recently undergone hormone treatment. He did not offer his own diagnosis or try to treat anything at the scene. He only provided information and let the emergency team work. When the ambulance left, he drove behind it to the hospital. In the emergency room, an ultrasound showed a hemorrhagic ovarian cyst with free fluid in my abdomen. The doctors kept me for observation to rule out ovarian torsion and manage the pain. I received IV fluids, blood tests, and several repeat ultrasounds through the night. When I was fully awake the next morning, the man was still at the hospital, sitting in a plastic chair in the hallway. "Lucas Hale," he said when he saw me looking out. "I'm a physician, though I'm currently taking a break from clinical practice. I live in the house about 400 meters south of yours." "Rachel Morgan," I replied. Lucas said nothing more about himself. He did not mention his specialty, why he was taking a break, or anything about his family or work. It took me a long time to learn how much Lucas had left out when he introduced himself only as a doctor on leave. He said only one thing about what had happened. "The hospital staff inventoried your belongings and locked them in the cabinet beside your bed. I didn't open anything. You should check to make sure everything is there." I opened the cabinet. My wallet, bank cards, documents, and laptop were all untouched. The laptop had never been opened. My treatment file was still exactly where I had packed it. It was the first time in months, perhaps years, that a man had helped me without taking anything from me in the process. He took no information beyond what the emergency team needed. He made no decisions for me. He did not tell me what I should do next with my life. That afternoon, One of the hospital physicians came into my room, carrying the records I had brought with me. "Mrs. Morgan," she said, turning through several pages, "I have a question about your monitoring schedule. I'm not drawing any conclusions, but I need you to confirm something." I nodded. "Why does the record say you were monitored and your medication dose was reduced on Friday?" she asked, "when the instruction sheet you brought still tells you to continue the old dose for 4 more days?" I could not answer the doctor's question that day. I remembered exactly what I had done during the final week of treatment, every injection and every early morning blood draw. But I did not remember anyone calling me on Friday to adjust the dose. I also did not remember any monitoring appointment taking place that day. "It could be a data entry error," she said, closing the file. "That happens more often than you might think. I'm not drawing any conclusions. I only think you should know these two things do not match." That was the first sentence in 5 years that made me begin thinking in a different direction. For 5 years, whenever something did not add up, I had assumed the error was me. My memory was wrong. My perception was wrong. My body was wrong. Not once had I allowed myself to consider that perhaps the record was what was wrong. I was discharged 2 days later with home monitoring instructions and a follow-up appointment. Lucas drove me back to the lake house. On the way, he said only one thing about what had happened at the hospital. "Mrs. Morgan, you have the right to request a complete copy of your records," he said. "Not the summary the clinic usually sends, the complete record." I asked what a complete record included. "Every consent form, along with the electronic signature certificate showing the time and the phone number that received the verification code," he replied. "Medication and monitoring schedules, embryology reports, communications between you and the clinic, and the history of updates to the phone number and email address in your patient record." I asked why he cared. Lucas was silent for a moment before answering. "Because it is your right," he said. "Whether you choose to exercise that right is not for me to decide." That night, I logged into Nova Life's patient portal with my own account and submitted a request for my complete records. I recorded the timestamp of every action and took screenshots of each step because I still remembered exactly what Ethan's complaint to my company had alleged. The request was processed within 24 hours. The next morning, a compressed file almost 400 megabytes in size appeared in my account. I began with the easiest section, the medication and monitoring schedule. Just as the hospital doctor had said, the record showed a dose adjustment on Friday the 18th. There was no call, email, or text from Nova Life that day. The medication instruction sheet I still had told me to continue the old dose for 4 more days. Then I opened the history of phone number and email updates in my patient record. That was when everything began to change. Ethan's phone number had been listed as a secondary contact for years. I had once agreed to let verification codes go to his phone on occasions when I could not hold mine. But in September of the previous year, Ethan's number had been changed to the primary contact number. My primary email address had also been replaced that same day. I did not rely on memory to conclude that I had not made those changes. I checked my email, text messages, and personal calendar. There was no confirmation notice, no update request, no evidence that I had changed the phone number or email address in the record. Finally, I opened the consent form section. There was a form I had never seen before. It authorized changes to the disposition of reproductive material stored under my name. The form had been electronically signed at 10:47 de la mañana. On the same day, I underwent the egg retrieval that produced C16, C17, and C18. I stared at that time for a long while. At 10:47, I was lying in recovery under sedation. My discharge papers clearly listed the time I entered the procedure room and the time I left recovery. During the period when the form was signed, I could not even sit up by myself. In the authentication section, the system said a verification code had been sent to a phone number and entered successfully. The patient copy displayed only the last 4 digits. Those 4 digits matched the end of Ethan's phone number. I had called that number thousands of times in 8 years. I did not need to look anything up to recognize it. But I also understood clearly that this detail was not enough to prove Ethan had signed for me. His number had been used to receive codes during treatment. Ethan could say I had authorized it. Part of that story was true. I had allowed verification codes to be sent to Ethan's phone and had let him read them back to me. but I had never authorized Ethan to read, approve, or sign a form on my behalf. He did not need to invent the entire story. He only needed to retell the part that favored him. I called Lucas the next morning and told him I had found a few things. "I think you should speak with an attorney before contacting Ethan or the clinic," Lucas said. "If you ask them now, they'll know what you've discovered, but the choice is still yours." He gave me the name and phone number of an attorney. "Maya Chen," he said. "I know her work. I can't promise she'll take the case, but she's good." I thanked him and ended the call. That night, I returned to the data file and opened the last section I had not touched, the embryology report. 3 codes appeared on the screen, exactly as I remember them. Segion 16. Segion 16. Segion 18. C-18 was listed as transferred and failed to implant. The C-18 entry had no final disposition record in the report I received. C-17 was listed as having stopped developing at 8:12 de la mañana. I was about to close the file when I saw a line of system history beneath the C-17 entry. Most patients would probably have skipped it, but it was the kind of data I had read every day throughout my career. 8:23 a.m. that same day. 11 minutes after C-17 was recorded as having stopped developing. Disposition status changed. I sat in front of the screen until almost 3 in the morning, reconstructing the sequence of those 11 minutes. This was the kind of work I had done throughout my entire career. No guessing, no speculation, only arranging the timestamps in the exact order they appeared and seeing what story they told. At 8:12 de la mañana, C-17 was recorded as having stopped developing and no longer being viable. At 8:23 de la mañana, 11 minutes later, the system recorded a new event. The disposition status had been changed. At 10:23 de la mañana, exactly 2 hours later, the record was changed back to its original status. Development stopped. 3 timestamps, a clear sequence of changes. But the status that existed during those 2 hours did not appear in the patient-facing record. That was what made me sit upright in my chair. In an embryo management system, every change had to leave a trace. That trace could belong to an employee or to an automated process. But in the record I received, the field identifying the user or process responsible was completely blank. I could not yet know whether that data did not exist in the internal system, had been omitted from the patient export, or had disappeared because of a synchronization error. I only knew I was not allowed to see it. I reopened the electronic form authorizing changes to the disposition of reproductive material stored under my name. In the downloaded data file, it existed as a complete PE to FA that looked no different from any valid form. I opened the accompanying certificate history. That section should have shown when the form was created, where it was sent, which device opened it, and when it was signed. But I found only 2 entries. Created and signed. There was no trace showing the form had ever been sent to me. There was no entry showing it had been opened on a device linked to my account. In Novolife's system, the form was marked as electronically signed, but I had never signed it. I called Maya Chen the next morning. She listened to me for almost 40 minutes without interrupting once. When I finished, the first thing she said was not what I expected. "Mrs. Morgan, I need you to understand one thing clearly before we go any further," Maya said. "What you just described does not prove that your embryo was used for anyone." I started to object, but she continued. "A status changed, and then changed back could be an employee error. A blank data field could be a synchronization problem between 2 systems. A form missing a complete certificate history is deeply concerning, but by itself, it is not proof of a crime." Maya paused for a beat. "If we enter this with an allegation we cannot prove, the other side will use that allegation to destroy your credibility. After that, everything you find will be viewed through the lens of your first accusation." I was silent for a long time. "Then what do we do?" I asked. "We accuse no one of anything," Maya replied. "We only tell them they are not allowed to delete anything." After completing a conflicts check, Maya sent me an electronic engagement agreement. I read it, signed it, and returned it before noon. That same afternoon, she sent preservation demands to Nova Life Reproductive Medical Group and Nova Life Management Services. The letter made no accusations. It only stated that I was evaluating my legal rights in connection with my treatment records. Maya required both entities to preserve patient records, system logs, communications, and every document related to the storage, transfer, custody, or disposition of the embryos. If they did nothing wrong, Maya told me over the phone, this letter is only a routine administrative matter. If there is data related to a dispute, the letter puts them under a duty to preserve it. Any alteration or deletion afterward could become evidence of spoliation. 48 hours after the letter was sent, Ethan called me. It was the first call from him since the day I left the house. "Rachel," he said, his voice so gentle I almost did not recognize it. "I heard you were in the hospital. Are you all right? Why didn't you call me?" I said I was fine. "Where are you staying? I can send you some money if you need it." I said I did not. He was silent for a beat. Then his tone changed, still soft, but the question was entirely different. "There is something I want to clear up. The clinic received a letter from your attorney. What records did you take?" He did not ask what I wanted. He did not ask why I needed an attorney. The first question Ethan asked after 2 minutes of pretending to care was what documents I had obtained. "I'm reviewing my own medical records, Ethan," I said. "Every patient has that right." His reaction came so quickly it almost overlapped my sentence. "You should be careful," he said, and the gentleness vanished completely from his voice. "Your company is still investigating you for unauthorized access to Nova Life data. What do you think it will look like if people discover you're digging through the clinic system in the middle of that?" "I'm not digging through the system. I requested a copy of my own records through the patient portal." "You can call it whatever you want." I ended the call not long after that. In 8 years of marriage, I had watched Ethan handle financial crises worth tens of millions of dollars without changing his tone. I had watched him sit through the most tense meetings with a perfectly calm expression. I had never seen him shift from tenderness to threat that quickly because of a preservation letter. People do not react that way to an administrative procedure. They react that way when they are afraid. That night, while I was waiting for water to boil in the kitchen, I checked my phone and saw that Madison had publicly reshared an old memory on her profile. It was a photograph taken in a room I recognized immediately. Pale blue walls, stainless steel equipment cabinets, and a wall-mounted monitor in the upper left corner. I had lain in that room 7 times. Beneath the photograph was the caption, "Remembering the day our miracle began." The original post date was in mid-October. The same day C-17 status was changed, remained different for 2 hours, and was then restored. I sat at the kitchen table with my cold tea and enlarged the photograph as far as it would go. It was Procedure Room Quattro at Nova Life's Kelmore Road facility. Madison stood in front of the procedure table with one hand on her abdomen, smiling at the camera. On her wrist was the same kind of patient identification band I had seen at the house. In the upper left corner of the photograph was the wall-mounted monitor. The interface was blurred, but I could still see the specimen code boxes and the status bar that normally appeared during embryo handling. The reshared post was dated that day, but the memory still displayed the original mid-October posting date. The exact day C-17 status had been changed. I did not comment, I did not click anything. I captured the entire screen, saved the link, recorded the exact time I saw it, and sent everything to Maya. She called me back within 20 minutes. "All right, Rachel," she said. It was the first time she called me by my first name. "I need you to listen carefully, because this is where many people in your position have damaged their own cases." I said I was listening. "This photograph does not prove Madison Cole is pregnant with your embryo," Maya said. "It does not prove anything about the genetic origin of the pregnancy." "Then what does it prove?" I asked. "It shows Madison was present in Nova Life's procedure area at a significant time," she replied. "The photograph and patient wristband contradict Ethan's story. He said there was no medication, no clinic, and no procedure of any kind. But Madison was in a procedure room at exactly the time her pregnancy began. Maya paused. That does not prove why Madison was there. It only gives us a direction to investigate. I understood the distinction. In my work, I did the same thing every day. You did not need to prove fraud immediately. You only needed to prove that someone's explanation did not match the data. 4 hours later, the post disappeared. I discovered that when I reopened the saved link and received only a notice that the content was no longer available. I called Maya again. Deleting the post does not prove anyone is guilty, she said immediately. People delete posts for many reasons. We also do not know whether Madison deleted it herself or someone told her to. Then what does his disappearance mean? It makes the screenshot, the link, and the time you saved it more important, Maya replied. Record only what happened. Do not infer more. I sat with that thought for the rest of the evening. And while I sat there, Madison's sentence from the house returned to me, this time carrying an entirely different weight. At least one of those rounds produced something worthwhile. At the time, I had understood it as an attempt at comfort, that what I had endured had at least meant something. But beside the patient wristband, the photograph in procedure room 4, and the time when CE-17's status was changed, the sentence no longer sounded comforting. Madison seemed to know that part of my treatment had produced something valuable to her. And Ethan's reaction showed that he was afraid she would keep talking. The next morning, I went to Lucas's house to thank him for driving me home from the hospital. I had not intended to discuss the case, but when I set my phone on the table, the screenshot of Madison's post was still open. Lucas did not ask anything about Madison. He looked at the photograph for about 3 seconds, then asked a question entirely different from what I expected. Can you enlarge the upper left corner? I enlarged it. It was the wall-mounted monitor in the procedure room. In the corner of the interface was a hexagonal icon and a row of status boxes I had never noticed. Lucas studied it for a long time. That is the chain of custody management system, he said, not the medical record. I said nothing. It records every time a specimen is removed from storage, handed off, or has its status changed, Lucas continued. Those actions are also stored in a separate audit log layer. Can that audit layer be changed? Clinic users cannot alter it through the ordinary operating interface, he replied. They can edit what is displayed on top, but the underlying audit layer may still preserve the original action. I asked how he knew so much about it. Lucas set down his coffee cup. It was the first time I saw him weigh his words before speaking, not from hesitation, but like a man deciding whether the time had come. Because my family's company built that system, he said. I could not answer for several seconds. Ms. Morgan, I need to be absolutely clear now, so there is no misunderstanding later. He continued, his voice shifting into the precise tone of someone accustomed to legal boundaries. I cannot open your record in that system. A company providing the software does not give anyone at the company the right to read patient data. If I accessed it on my own, I would break the law and compromise the value of any evidence found. Then can the audit layer help? Your authorization would help Maya request a limited forensic examination of your records, Lucas said. But the examination must be conducted by an independent expert, with the cooperation of the data custodian or under proper legal authority. He paused and looked directly at me. If Maya obtains lawful authority to examine it, and that audit layer is still intact, an independent forensic expert may be able to identify the account or process that changed the chain of custody. I sat in the chair across from Lucas on the porch. Over the next 20 minutes, he told me who he really was. Lucas Hale, 42, was a reproductive endocrinologist. That was the part he had not told me at the hospital. He was also the controlling shareholder of Hale Biomedical Systems, the company founded by his family that developed chain of custody management systems for assisted reproduction centers across the country. Nova Life Management Services had contracted with Hale Biomedical to deploy the system at 7 clinical facilities operated by Nova Life Reproductive Medical Group. I sat in silence for a long time after Lucas finished. My first feeling was not relief. It was closer to suspicion. Over the previous few days, I had learned that when a man held far more power than I realized, it was rarely good news for me. Why didn't you tell me from the beginning? I asked. Because you had just been hospitalized and had no obligation to process that information, Lucas replied. And because if I had told you then, everything I did afterward would have looked like a man trying to gain access. That answer did not completely erase my caution, but it was more honest than I expected. Lucas explained the most important boundary between his company and Nova Life again. Hale Biomedical owns the software, source code, and technical infrastructure, he said. Nova Life Reproductive Medical Group controls the clinical records. Patients have access rights and privacy rights in their own data. He looked at me. Owning the cabinet does not give me the right to open what is inside. So you cannot see my records, I said. I cannot, and I will not, Lucas replied. If I access them on my own, I could violate confidentiality duties, face legal liability, and give Ethan grounds to challenge the entire chain of evidence. Even if I give permission? Your permission is only one part, he said. There must also be lawful authority to examine the records, a clearly defined scope, and an independent forensic firm. I cannot perform the examination myself. That was when I began to trust Lucas, not because he promised to help me, but because he was the first person in the story to explain what he was not allowed to do. We called Maya that same afternoon. She built the legal framework for the entire process within 2 days. I signed a limited authorization. Its scope covered only events in the chain of custody system directly related to my 3 embryo codes, C16, C17, and C18. No data belonging to any other patient could be accessed. Madison Cole's clinical record could not be opened. The extraction had to be performed by an independent forensic firm, not Hale Biomedical personnel. Every person who touched the data, every time and every action had to be logged to preserve the chain of custody. We are not taking shortcuts, Maya said as I signed. Every time you want to take one, remember that the other side is hoping you will. But my signature alone was still not enough to open the technical audit layer. Lucas referred the matter to Hale Biomedical's legal department. They reviewed the technology contract with Nova Life Management Services and confirmed that an audit provision was triggered by any incident affecting chain of custody integrity. Nova Life was notified that an independent forensic firm would conduct a limited examination of the technical audit layer associated with my 3 embryo codes. The scope did not include Madison's treatment record or the record of any other patient. While we waited for the forensic firm to begin, Lucas told me something he was fully entitled to disclose because it concerned the contractual relationship between the 2 companies, not patient data. Nova Life Management Services is 3/4 behind on its technology fees, he said. They have also breached the incident reporting provision. I asked what the provision required. Any incident affecting chain of custody integrity must be reported to the vendor within 72 hours. Lucas opened an incident summary his legal department had authorized him to discuss. The incident occurred in mid-October at the Kelmore facility, he said, but Nova Life did not submit the report until early November, after the contractual deadline. How did they describe the incident? A synchronization error between the display layer and the back-end system. The incident window lasted about 3 hours. What date? Lucas looked at me. The same day sedated status was changed for 2 hours and then restored. I set my tea down because my hand had begun to shake. Sedadet's anomalous 2-hour period fell entirely inside that 3-hour incident window. I need to be clear, Lucas said immediately. Synchronization failures are real and can happen. This incident report does not prove anyone concealed data. But it gives them an explanation. Yes, he replied. If someone wanted to hide an action, that incident window would let them call every discrepancy a technical error. I asked Lucas one final question before leaving, one that had been circling in my mind all afternoon. Lucas, why are you living alone in a house by the lake when you own an entire company? He was silent for a long time. I left my operating role 2 years ago, he said. There was a proposal to commercialize de-identified patient data to increase the company's value before a financing round. Legally, it fell within an allowed area. I opposed it. The board approved the proposal anyway within its delegated authority. Lucas did not tell me more about what happened afterward. I still hold the controlling interest in oversight rights, he said, but I am no longer involved in day-to-day operations. He looked out at the lake. I did not want to sit in a room where people discussed patients the way they discussed a revenue line. 4 days later, the forensic firm delivered its first extraction. Maya called me close to 9 that night. I knew from her voice that something had changed. "Rachel," she said, "we have the record from CDSCZ's technical audit layer." I sat down on the front steps of the house. "There is no destruction record," Maya said. "No specimen disposition procedure. No compliant cancellation log." She paused. "CDSC was scanned out of storage, Rachel." I gripped the phone. "The action was performed with a valid code scan," Maya continued. "C17 left storage." "Then what happened?" "There is no record showing it ever came back." The complete extraction was delivered to Maya's office the next morning, and I drove more than an hour to be there when the forensic firm presented its findings. The lead examiner was a specialist named Alvarez, who worked for an independent forensic company with no relationship to Hale Biomedical or Nova Life. He placed 3 summaries on the table, one for each embryo code. CADSCCs showed no anomalies, so the presentation focused on CADSC7 and CADSC8. Alvarez confirmed that the complete extraction did not change the initial conclusion about CADSC7. C17 was scanned out of the primary storage unit at 8:18 a.m., he said. 5 minutes later, the specimen's status was changed in the display layer. The scan was technically valid. It was performed with an identification badge authorized to operate in storage. After that point, there is no record showing C17 returned, was transferred to another facility, or was processed under a destruction protocol. "Then where is it?" I asked. "The chain of custody system cannot answer that question," Alvarez replied. "It only shows that the specimen left storage and that no subsequent record exists. Determining where it went is outside the scope of the data we were authorized to access." Then he moved to the third summary. "C18 is different," Alvarez said. "The specimen still exists." I felt my heart strike hard once. "But its physical location does not match the patient summary," he continued. "The summary says C18 remains in primary storage at the Kelmore facility. The technical audit layer shows it was moved to an auxiliary storage tank in December." "What is an auxiliary storage tank?" I asked. Kied. Lucas answered because this concerns system architecture, not another patient's data. "It is an area for specimens awaiting transfer to another facility, subject to a dispute, or requiring review before disposition," he said. "The specimens remain temperature-controlled and continue to be tracked in the system." Patient summaries do not usually show the location of each individual tank, but in this case, the summary also incorrectly states that CADSC8 remains in primary storage. In other words, my last embryo still existed, but it had been moved from the location visible in my patient record. What silenced the entire room was what Alvarez said next. "There is a pending technical request in the system," he said. "It was created 11 days ago by an account belonging to Nova Life Management Services." "What does it request?" Maya asked. "A network-wide inventory synchronization before the audit is completed." Maya looked up. "Can Nova Life Management Services use that request to decide what happens to an embryo?" "No," Alvarez replied. "It is a non-clinical operations account. The request can only initiate a review and standardization of inventory data." Lucas continued. "But the synchronization process can push a status that currently exists only in the technical layer into the operating system," he said. "If C18 is tagged with a status, such as pending disposition or storage authorization expired, the specimen could be moved into a queue for review by the clinical entity. Then someone with authority at Nova Life Reproductive Medical Group could rely on that status to take the next step." I understood immediately what he meant. If the synchronization occurred, C18's hidden status could surface in the operating system. From there, the embryo could be placed in a disposition queue based on a status I had never approved. On paper, every step that followed could look completely routine. That was also why Ethan kept pressuring me to sign the embryo disposition form. The system already contained an electronic form bearing my name, but I was disputing its validity. What Ethan needed was a genuine signature on paper to cover everything that had happened before it. We ask for a temporary order preserving the status quo, Maya said, beginning to take notes. Today, I asked what we would be asking the court to decide. We are not asking the court to decide ownership or use rights over C18, she replied. We are only asking the court to preserve the status quo. No one may destroy or move C18. No one may alter or delete data related to C16, C17, or C18 until the court orders otherwise. Maya tapped the tip of her pen against the pad. A destroyed embryo cannot be restored with money damages. That is why we keep the request narrow and focused on irreparable harm. While preparing the motion, the forensic firm found one more detail. In early November, on the same day Novalife submitted its late report about the mid-October incident, an exception report had been created in the system. The report stated that the chain of custody records for C17 and C18 did not match between the display layer and the technical audit layer. The report had been created by Nora Kim, a senior embryologist. 6 hours later, it was closed with a reason. Synchronization incident verified and resolved. The person who approved closing the report was Dr. Victor Sloan, Novalife's medical director. Maya had someone contact Nora Kim the next day. Nora listened to the entire call and declined to meet. She did not deny anything, Maya told me. She only said she has a job, a professional certification, and cannot afford to lose both. I did not yet know whether Nora was a witness, someone pressured into silence, or part of the concealment. But I understood how fear of losing a job and an entire career could keep someone quiet. Maya filed the emergency motion that same day. The court issued a temporary order preserving the status quo on the next business day. It did not decide ownership or use rights over the embryo. It only required everything to remain in place until the court reviewed the matter further. A copy of the order was served on Novalife Reproductive Medical Group, Novalife Management Services, and the relevant parties at 10 that morning. Ethan called me at 10:27. He no longer pretended to care. "Do you know what you just did?" he shouted, so loudly that I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "You just froze part of the inventory system in the middle of our audit. Do you understand how much that costs? You're sabotaging something you do not understand even 1% of." I let him finish. Then I answered in the most ordinary voice I could manage. "I did not take anything from you, Ethan," I said. "I only stopped you from making something disappear that never belonged to you alone." The other end of the line was silent for about 3 seconds. Then Ethan said something he clearly had not intended to say. A sentence I immediately wrote down word for word and sent to Maya after the call. "You keep worrying about the embryo still in the freezer," he said. "You have no idea how far along the other pregnancy is." Ethan's final sentence in that call kept me awake for 3 nights. "You have no idea how far along the other pregnancy is." Maya reread my verbatim note several times before giving her assessment. "This is a very damaging statement for Ethan," she said, "but it is still not evidence by itself. He can say he was only referring to the number of weeks in the pregnancy. We need data, not a sentence spoken in anger." So I returned to the only thing I was truly good at. Over the next 2 weeks, I sat with an independent embryology expert hired by Maya and reviewed all 5 years of my treatment. 6 egg retrieval cycles. 7 embryo transfers. Those 7 transfers came from the embryos produced across 6 retrieval cycles. 1 cycle supplied embryos for more than 1 transfer. We reviewed hundreds of pages of reports, hormone charts, laboratory results, clinical notes, and lab records. I entered that work with an expectation, and I need to be honest about it. Part of me wanted to find proof that all 5 years had been false, that every failure had been staged, that my body had never been responsible for any of them. That was not what we found. "The first 2 cycles show no signs of irregularity," the expert said. "The protocols were reasonable. Your ovarian response was low, but that can happen in fertility treatment." He turned to the next set of records. In the 3rd cycle, the embryo stopped developing on day 5. The records also show no evidence of interference. This is a medical failure that can occur naturally. I sat looking at those pages and felt something difficult to name. The failures in those first 3 cycles were real. The pain was real. No one had taken anything from me in those rounds. They were simply what many people undergoing fertility treatment experience. and there was no villain for me to blame. Somehow that hurt even more. But by the fourth cycle, inconsistencies began appearing in the records. The Day 3 lab report records 4 embryos, 2 of them with good morphology grades, the expert said. But the cycle summary sent to the patient lists only 3 embryos. The records you receive do not explain the difference. Does the documentation say what happened to the other entry? I asked. No. But we also cannot conclude that an embryo was taken simply because the summary is missing one line. The patient record may be incomplete, the classification may have changed, or a document may not have been produced. He marked that section for Maya to request additional records. Similar inconsistencies appeared in the 5th and 6th cycles. In the final 3 cycles, the embryos transferred to me were not the ones with the highest morphology grades at the time of the initial assessment. That did not automatically mean the clinical selection was wrong. An embryo may be chosen based on development rate, test results, survival after thawing, or other factors not reflected in a simple ranking table. The problem was that the records I received did not state the clinical reasons for those choices. And I had never been told that the embryos transferred to me were not the highest graded embryos in the same cycles. For 5 years, I had received only brief summaries. Embryo meets transfer criteria. Prognosis appropriate. Recommend proceeding. I had never seen the detailed grading sheet for any embryo. I had never thought to request it, because I trusted the doctors to choose the best option for me. There is one more point, the expert said, turning to another set of documents. In the first 3 cycles, the lab notes are detailed and signed by the embryologist responsible. Beginning with the 4th cycle, those detailed notes no longer appear in the patient-facing records. They are replaced by generalized summaries issued by administration. I asked who had signed the embryology notes in the first 3 cycles. Nora Kim, he replied. Then Maya placed my billing records and lawfully obtained corporate documents on the table. Every treatment cycle generated revenue for Nova Life: medication, procedures, testing, monitoring, and storage. Nova Life was paid for the course of treatment, whether the final result was success or failure. A failed cycle could also lead to another cycle. That did not prove Nova Life intentionally caused patients to fail, but it showed that treatment outcomes and the network's financial interests did not always move in the same direction. The corporate documents showed that part of Dr. Victor Sloan's compensation as medical director was tied to the network's overall financial performance. That compensation structure was not automatically illegal and did not prove he had made the wrong clinical decisions for me, but it created a conflict of interest that had to be examined alongside the inconsistencies in my records. As Chief Financial Officer of Nova Life Management Services, Ethan had access to financial data and knew exactly how much revenue each treatment cycle generated for the network. But Ethan did not have authority to choose which embryo would be transferred, change a clinical order, or direct the disposition of an embryo on his own. If he had interfered, he would have had to do it through someone with clinical authority, or by manipulating records and operational processes. We still did not have enough evidence to say when that had begun. I sat in Maya's conference room and asked the question I feared most. So Ethan planned this from the first year? Maya shook her head, and I valued her honesty more than any reassurance. There is no evidence of that, she said, and I do not want you saying it anywhere as though it were true. Maya placed her hand on the first 3 files. The data shows no signs of irregularity in the first 3 cycles. Then she touched the remaining 3. Beginning with the 4th cycle, the records contain discrepancies that require explanation. But who created them, why they did it, and when Ethan became involved are not conclusions we have enough evidence to make. Then what do we know? Your original pain was real, Maya said. What we are investigating is whether someone exploited that process at some later point. I drove home that night with a strange feeling. For weeks, I had clung to the idea that everything was a lie. Because if everything was a lie, I would not have to keep asking what role my body had played in those failures. But the truth was more complicated. In the first 3 cycles, I had failed in the way human beings sometimes fail, not because anyone was controlling the outcome from behind the scenes. And in the middle of that real pain, Anomalies began appearing in the records that no one had explained to me. I could not yet say Ethan had created them. I only knew he had lied about sedated, pressured me to surrender my rights to the remaining embryos, and panicked when the records were preserved. That did not make me less angry. It only made my anger more precise. 4 days later, Maya called me in the evening. Nora Kim just made contact, she said. Not directly. She retained her own attorney and had that attorney call me. I asked what Nora had said. Maya was silent for a beat, and when she repeated the sentence, I had to sit down. She said, I do not know where K-17 was taken, but it was still viable when it left the lab. Nora Kim did not meet with me. That was the first and only condition her attorney imposed. Nora would meet Maya at her own attorney's office with legal representatives for both sides present. No private meeting with me. No direct conversation with me in any form. At first, that hurt, but Maya explained it before she left. She is doing the right thing, Rachel, Maya said. If Nora met with you privately, the other side could argue that her account had been influenced by a patient with a personal motive. Keeping her distance does not automatically turn what she says into evidence, but it limits their ability to accuse the two of you of coordinating your stories. Nora brought no records, no documents, no printouts, no hard drive. She made clear from the beginning that she had no right to copy patient data or remove it from Nova Life, and she had no intention of crossing that line. The only thing Nora provided was a number. It was the reference number of the exception report she had created on the day of the mid-October incident. After the incident, Nora had written that reference code in a personal record of her professional activities. The record contained no patient name, embryo code, or clinical information. Only the report number. Then Nora described what had happened. That morning, she was preparing for an embryo transfer that had been placed on the laboratory schedule. When she checked the transfer order, Nora found that C17 was linked to one source record, but the recipient identifier belonged to a different patient. That did not automatically mean misconduct had occurred. Embryos can be transferred to another person under circumstances permitted by law and clinical procedure. But complete consent documentation and identity verification were required. Nora checked a second time. The information still did not match. Then she opened the electronic signature certificate attached to the consent form. The transfer order had already been issued to the laboratory. C17 had already been scanned out of storage, but the electronic consent form was completed only after those actions had begun. In other words, the transfer process had started before the system contained a completed consent form. Nora continued reviewing the authentication data. The electronic certificate showed that the verification code had not been sent directly to the phone number listed for the person named as the signer. It had been sent to another contact number attached to the record. The name signer was Rachel Morgan. The number that received the code was associated with Ethan Morgan. That was what caused Nora to stop the entire process. She opened an exception report and refused to continue handling CE-17 until the discrepancies in recipient identity, consent timing, and verification phone number were resolved. Dr. Victor Sloan arrived about 20 minutes later. He did not enter the specimen handling area. He asked Nora to step into a small consultation room outside the laboratory. According to Nora, Dr. Sloan did not appear angry. He was very calm, very professional. He said this was a family arrangement that had been handled at a higher level. The paperwork was simply being completed later than the real-world decision. And Nora did not need to concern herself with the administrative side. Nora still refused. Then Ethan appeared in the administrative area outside the lab. Nora recognized him immediately because Ethan was Chief Financial Officer of Nova Life Management Services and frequently visited the facilities to work with operations. But it was the first time she had seen a chief financial officer appear to explain an issue directly related to an embryo transfer order. Ethan said his wife had agreed, that it was a joint decision between husband and wife, that there were private matters the family did not want described in detail in the record, and he hoped Nora would respect that. Nora asked whether Rachel Morgan had directly confirmed the transfer of CE-17 to another recipient's record. Ethan replied that the form had been signed and the verification code had been entered successfully. Nora said that did not resolve the discrepancies she had documented. When she continued to refuse, Dr. Sloan instructed Nora to turn the case over to another embryologist and remove herself from the handling process. Nora did not perform the transfer herself. She also did not witness what happened to sedated after she was removed from the case. But when Nora handed over control, sedated was still viable. Madison Cole was present in the facility's waiting area that morning. Nora made clear that Madison did not enter the lab and did not touch any specimen. Nora also did not know what Ethan or Dr. Sloan had told Madison about the embryo's source. She could not confirm that Madison knew sedated belonged to another patient. She certainly could not say that Madison knew the consent form was problematic. That is the limit Nora set, Maya told me afterward. She can confirm Madison was present at the facility, but she does not know what Madison was told, and she refuses to speculate. 6 hours after it was created, Nora's exception report was closed. The reason recorded in the system was, "Code entry error verified and corrected." The person who approved closing it was Dr. Victor Sloan. No one asked Nora before it was closed. "Why didn't she report it higher up?" I asked Maya when she returned. Maya set her notes on the table. "Nora says she did," she replied. 3 days after the incident, she sent an internal email to compliance. Does she still have the email? No, and for now that is only information Nora has provided. I have asked Novalife to preserve and produce the email so we can verify it. What happened after that? Nora says she received no response. 2 weeks later, she was told that her scope of work would be adjusted and she would no longer handle cases in the priority patient group. Then she stayed silent. Maya repeated. She watched me for a moment before continuing. Nora depends entirely on her professional certification and employment. Embryology is a very small field. If she is labeled a difficult employee, she could lose her job and have great difficulty finding another position. I listened and realized something I had never considered. This required 2 kinds of people. People who actively crossed the line, and people who saw something wrong and chose silence. Ethan and Dr. Sloan belonged to the first group, but the system survived because of the second. An embryologist afraid of losing her career. A compliance department that did not respond. Operations staff who continued following the status displayed on the screen because they trusted that the person before them had checked it. Not everyone had to participate in a conspiracy. They only had to stop asking questions. Nora gave us no records. She gave us only a report number. But that number was the key. With the exact reference code, the forensic firm no longer had to search through millions of system events. It knew which record to request, during which time period, and in which technical audit layer. Using the number Nora provided, Maya sent a supplemental extraction request within the scope of the preservation order and the established forensic examination protocol. The request was limited to the original exception report, the history of its creation, modification, and closure, the transfer order directly linked to C17, and the recipient data field attached to that order. The forensic firm did not open the recipient's clinical record. It extracted only data located directly within C17's chain of custody. The request was sent on Tuesday. The original record reached Maya's office Thursday afternoon. In the recipient field of CE-17's transfer order, there was a name. Madison Cole. Maya read the extraction results to me over the phone on Thursday afternoon, and I still remember exactly where I was standing as I heard each sentence. I was in the kitchen of the lake house, still holding the kettle. The technical audit layer shows que 17 was scanned out of primary storage at 8:18 de la mañana, Maya said. It was transported internally and scanned into procedure room 4:29. The recipient field in the transfer order lists Madison Cole. I set down the kettle. Rachel, are you still there? I'm here, I said. There is one more thing, and I need you to hear it from me before you hear it from anyone else, Maya said. The extraction also contains the procedure completion report. It confirms that CEDSCCA was the only embryo placed in Madison's transfer that morning. I braced one hand against the edge of the table. Madison's name in the recipient field changes the meaning of something we already knew, Maya continued. C17 was created from your egg and Ethan's sperm. We do not yet have independent genetic data from the current pregnancy, so I will not say more than the records prove. But C17 was transferred to Madison, and the timing of the procedure matches the beginning of her pregnancy. I could not speak for a length of time I could not estimate. Maybe 10 seconds. Maybe a minute. C17 had not died the way they told me it had. The embryo. Ethan used to prove my body was broken. The embryo recorded as having stopped developing. The embryo transferred to Madison on the day she called the day our miracle began, had been created from my own egg. At least once, my body had not failed the way Ethan had made me believe. That was the first thought that came into my mind, and I was ashamed of it for weeks afterward. Because of everything that had just been revealed, the first thing I thought about was myself. For 5 years, I had lived believing I was the defective variable in the equation, that my body could not produce a viable embryo. But C17 was still viable when it left the lab. They had only taken away my right to decide what happened to it. The second thought came immediately afterward, and it was far heavier. There was a pregnancy progressing somewhere out there. A child who might be born within only a few months. A child completely innocent of everything the adults had done to one another. I called Lucas that night, not to ask for advice, but because I needed to say this out loud to someone. He listened to all of it. Then Lucas said something for which I remain grateful even now. "Rachel, I cannot tell you who that child belongs to," he said. "I do not have the right to decide that, and the child is not an object for anyone to reclaim or keep. But I know they took from you the right to know, the right to consent, and the right to decide for yourself how your embryo would be used." I sat in silence for a long time after that. Maya called the next morning and spent nearly an hour explaining the legal framework, because she knew this was the point where one impulsive act could destroy everything. "I'm going to be direct, and you will not like hearing this," she said. "The legal questions involving a child born under circumstances like these are extremely complex, and they vary from state to state. The fact that an embryo was created from your gametes does not automatically establish legal parentage over a child born from that embryo. The person who carries and gives birth to the child has a very significant legal position. Cases like this can proceed in many different directions." Maya paused. "If we rush into a parentage battle now, the case could last for years, cost enormous amounts of money, and turn an unborn child into the center of a public dispute." "Then what do we do?" I asked. "We pursue 2 goals at the same time," Maya said. "Preserve the evidence and make sure the investigation does not cause unnecessary harm to the pregnancy or the child. We do not turn the child into leverage." She continued slowly and clearly. "I strongly advise you not to contact Madison Cole under any circumstances. Do not call. Do not text. Do not appear at her workplace. Do not contact her through anyone else. If you contact her directly, the other side may use it to seek a restraining order. From that point on, they will try to shift the focus from forged records to an allegation that you are harassing a pregnant woman." I understood. I also knew Ethan was waiting for exactly that. "There is one more thing I want to do," I said. "Tell me." "I want all identifying information and medical records related to that pregnancy protected if this goes to court. I do not want the child's name appearing in any public document." Maya was silent for a moment on the other end. "I can seek a protective order," she said. "We can ask to redact identifying information, use initials, and seal necessary medical records. I cannot promise the court will grant every part of the request. It may also limit how we can use or disclose certain documents in the case." "I understand," I said. "All right," she replied. "I will include that request in our filing." That night, I sat on the steps for a long time, looking out at the lake and thinking about the line I had almost crossed. In the few short hours after Maya's call, part of me had begun thinking of that child as something stolen from me. Something that had to be taken back. And I understood that if I continued down that line of thought, I would become another version of the people who had done this to me. Someone who treated an embryo, a pregnancy, and a human being as assets to be divided. Ethan had treated our embryo like property that could be transferred with a forged signature. Dr. Sloan had placed the system's power and interests above my right to consent. If I now treated that child as something to be reclaimed, I would also be turning a human being into property. The only difference would be that I believed my reason was more righteous. I wrote one sentence in my notebook that night, and I reread it many times in the weeks that followed. I do not know what I am to that child. But I know I never agreed to let someone else decide for me. 3 days later, Nova Life produced the next set of internal documents within the scope of the Maya's preservation demand and limited production request. Maya called me close to midnight, and her voice sounded different from every other call. "Rachel, I just finished reviewing an incident response file prepared by Ethan's department," she said. "I need you to sit down." I told her I was sitting. "Ethan Morgan prepared a defense narrative in advance," Maya said. "The file assigns responsibility to someone else for requesting the phone number change, updating the email address, and using authentication credentials on your patient account. That person is not Ethan." "Then who is it?" "Madison Cole." I drove to Maya's office early the next morning to see the documents for myself. They were part of the limited production Nova Life Management Services was required to make under the court's order after the preservation order had been issued. Ethan had signed a certification that Nova Life Management Services had complied with the production request, but the actual collection had been performed by the legal department and an electronic discovery vendor. Perhaps Ethan believed nothing in the production could be used against him. Maya spread 3 sets of documents across the table. The first was an activity log from the internal administrative system. In September of the previous year, the request to change the contact information in my patient record had been submitted from Madison Cole's work account. That account had limited authority to update contact information and assist with patient portal access. "Then she did it," I said. "Keep reading," Maya replied. The next page was the authentication log for that same account. At the time the request was submitted, Madison's account was being used on a workstation with an asset number assigned to the finance executive offices on the 12th floor of the headquarters building, not the 4th floor, where Madison's patient relations department was located. "This does not prove Ethan was sitting at that computer," Maya said immediately, as she always did when I was in danger of concluding too quickly. "It also does not prove Madison was not on the 12th floor or did not voluntarily provide her login credentials, but it shows the action was not taken from her ordinary workstation." Maya turned to the next page. And this is the important part. The second set was an unsent draft letter stored in Ethan's user directory on the Nova Life Management Services server and collected from his work account. It was a letter to Human Resources, written in the voice of a chief financial officer who had just discovered misconduct by a subordinate. In it, Ethan stated that Madison Cole, acting with good intentions to assist a patient who was the wife of a company executive, had independently changed contact information in the record without following verification procedures. The letter recommended an internal review of every account update Madison had performed during the previous 18 months. The draft had been created in December, weeks before I left the house and before Maya sent any legal demand to Nova Life. The third set was a prepared termination package for Madison. It included a draft termination notice, a separation agreement, and severance terms. Everything had been prepared except the effective date and final signatures. I sat staring at those 3 files for a long time. "He prepared a scapegoat from the beginning," I said. "Not 1, Maya replied, 2. She pushed a much thinner file toward me. "You were the first line of defense," Maya said. The security complaint to my employer had been prepared and activated before I left the house. It isolated me from my work, damaged my credibility, and established a story that I was a technically skilled person improperly accessing Nova Life data to retaliate against an estranged husband. "Madison was the second line of defense," Maya continued. "If investigators trace the actions taken on your patient account, Ethan had a file ready to say she acted on her own." What did Madison think? Maya turned to the final group of documents. These communications came from the corporate messaging system and had been produced because they appeared in the same package Ethan had prepared to assign responsibility to Madison. According to the internal messages, Madison believed she was about to become Ethan's wife, Maya said. She also believed she would have a seat on the Nova Life Family Foundation's executive board. There was a message thread in which Madison asked about adding her name to the foundation's records. And what did Ethan say? He said he would handle it after the divorce was final. Maya closed the file. But the produced documents contain no written commitment to give Madison a foundation position. There is no asset transfer agreement, no joint ownership, no guarantee of employment after the transaction. All Madison has are Ethan's promises. I sat in that room feeling something I had not expected. Not sympathy. I had not forgiven Madison, and I was not sure I ever would. She had stood in my living room wearing my coat and choosing paint colors for the room I had kept empty for 5 years. She knew far more about my treatment than her job required. She had accepted Ethan's story without asking questions that should have been asked. But looking at the 3 files on the table, I realized something that sent a chill through me. Ethan had used the same method on both of us. He gave each of us the story she wanted to believe. For me, it was the story of a patient husband walking beside me through 5 difficult years. For Madison, it was the story of a man about to escape a childless marriage and start over. He controlled all the paperwork, my medical records, Madison's work account, authentication information, and financial approvals. For each of us, he had a file ready to assign blame when he needed one. We were not 2 women fighting over a man. We were 2 lines of defense in the same plan. Lucas reacted more strongly than anyone when he learned. "I think Madison needs to be warned before Ethan activates that file," he said. "She is pregnant and trusts a man who has already prepared her termination papers." Lucas looked at Maya, then at me. "But I understand that whether she is contacted must be Rachel's decision after receiving legal advice." Maya answered more firmly than I had ever heard her. "I do not advise Rachel to contact Madison now," she said. "There are 3 risks. First, Madison may immediately tell Ethan because she still trusts him. Second, an early warning may cause the people involved to coordinate their accounts or attempt to alter or delete data the forensic firm has not yet collected. Third, any direct contact from Rachel could be used to seek a restraining order or shift the focus to an allegation that she is harassing a pregnant woman." Maya turned toward me. "But this is your decision." I sat in silence for a long time. I thought about how many weeks I had lived without anyone telling me the truth, and what that had taken from me. Then I thought about C18 in an auxiliary storage tank. If the remaining data disappeared, there would be nothing left to prove anything, even for Madison. "We wait," I said at last, "but I want one thing." "Tell me," Maya replied. "I want you to prepare a path for Madison to obtain independent counsel if she decides to cooperate. I also want a plan to protect the privacy of her pregnancy and medical records while avoiding unnecessary disruption to her medical care. When Madison finally understands where she stands, I do not want her forced to choose between telling the truth and losing everything." Maya watched me for a moment, then wrote in her notebook. "I can prepare a list of independent attorneys and a protocol for contacting her through her counsel," Maya said. "I cannot represent both of you because your interests may conflict. But I can prepare a proposed protective order in advance, limiting access to medical records and preventing unnecessary public disclosure of pregnancy information." "All right," I said. 4 days later, a press release appeared on Nova Life's website and in 2 major financial publications. Nova Life Management Services was negotiating an $84 million transaction involving the management platform, non-clinical assets, and operating contracts supporting all 7 Nova Life facilities. Ethan Morgan was quoted in the release as chief financial officer. He said the transaction would open a new chapter for thousands of families placing their hope in Nova Life. I drove to Lucas's house that same afternoon, with a printed copy of the press release on the passenger seat. He opened the door, looked at the paper in my hand, and nodded as though he already knew why I had come. "Counsel for the independent committee has just authorized me to explain the part directly related to my conflict of interest," Lucas said. "I was going to call after the announcement was released." We sat at his kitchen table, and Lucas told me the rest. Hale Reproductive Holdings, an entity within his family's group of companies, was one of the parties participating in the process to acquire Nova Life Management Services. Preliminary discussions had begun 11 months earlier, when Nova Life Management Services fell 3/4 behind on technology fees, and an initial review showed its data management infrastructure was seriously deteriorating. 11 months earlier, before even my final treatment cycle, long before the afternoon Lucas found me unconscious on the porch. "I need you to understand that," Lucas said. "This transaction did not begin because of you, and it will not end because of you." Then he told me the part I had not expected. "And I am no longer allowed to make any decisions about this transaction." I asked why. "Because I assisted a patient who is in a legal dispute with the seller," Lucas replied. "I also provided technical information related to your dispute. If I remained involved, the seller could accuse the buyer of using your case to pressure the price or change the terms of the transaction. It could also undermine the independence of the evidence you are building." Lucas had disclosed the conflict as soon as Maya formally notified the buyer of the dispute and sent the preservation demand. An independent committee was formed, consisting of uninvolved board members and an outside advisory firm. From that point on, Lucas attended no transaction meetings, received no diligence reports, and learned nothing about the price terms being negotiated beyond what was publicly disclosed. I sat in silence for a long time. I have to be honest, when I read the press release, part of me briefly thought something I am not proud to admit: that if Lucas was the buyer, perhaps everything was already over. That all he had to do was make one phone call, remove Ethan from the company, open the entire system, and end everything within a week. "I know what you're thinking," Lucas said, "and I will say it plainly so you do not have to ask." He set down his coffee cup. "I will not use this transaction as a weapon of revenge for you. Not because I do not want Ethan Morgan to face consequences, but because every decision must protect continuous system operations, the people storing specimens at Nova Life, and the independence of the investigation." More than 2,300 active storage accounts existed across Nova Life's 7-facility network, representing thousands of patients and families. Lucas explained something I had never considered until then. An embryo and gamete storage center is not like an ordinary business. It cannot simply stop operating for several weeks while everyone waits for a court ruling. It needs continuous power, a stable supply of liquid nitrogen, technicians monitoring temperatures every day, all alarm systems functioning 24 hours a day. If Nova Life loses its ability to operate before someone takes over, Lucas said, the risk is not that the storage tanks immediately stop working. The risk is staff leaving, vendors stopping service, monitoring systems going unmaintained, and thousands of specimens having to be transferred in chaos. The people hurt most would not be the executives. They would be the patients and families depending on those systems. He looked at me. "Including you." I thought about C-18 in an auxiliary tank at the Kelmore facility, dependent on the system continuing to operate correctly. "Then what is the purpose of the acquisition?" I asked. "Any responsible buyer would have to maintain storage operations and secure power, nitrogen, and technical staff," Lucas replied. "They could stabilize non-clinical operations, replace leadership at Nova Life Management Services if the independent committee determined that was necessary, and rebuild data controls. But they would not automatically have authority to make clinical decisions for Nova Life Reproductive Medical Group." "What about the data?" "The buyer could lock administrative privileges controlled by Nova Life Management Services, continue complying with the preservation order, and require the clinical entity to preserve data under the contracts and court orders." Lucas paused. "I proposed those principles before I withdrew from the transaction, but how the committee applies them is no longer my decision." Then he said something I had not asked but needed to hear. "You are not a party to this transaction, Rachel. You do not have the right to direct the buyer. You are a patient in the network, a provider of evidence in the investigation, and a party with separate civil claims. Those 3 roles are already important. But they do not give you the right to decide who buys the company or at what price." I was not angry at him for saying it. On the contrary, it made me trust Lucas more. For the previous several weeks, I had lived among men who promised to take care of everything for me. Ethan handled the money. Ethan handled the paperwork. Ethan handled the verification codes. Each promise to handle something took another piece of decision-making away from me until I had nothing left in my hands. Lucas was the first man to tell me he would not take care of it for me and explain exactly why. "Then what do Maya and I need from you?" I asked. "Nothing from me," Lucas replied. "But if the independent committee or diligence firm contacts Maya about compliance issues found during the review, you have the right to decide whether to cooperate. That is your decision after receiving Maya's advice, not mine." 3 days later, the independent diligence firm contacted Maya's office. I agreed to cooperate, but Maya required every communication to pass through her office. She prepared a summary of verified events and produced only the documents necessary for the stated purpose. We did not waive attorney-client privilege, and we did not open Madison's clinical record. I asked for 3 things to be put in writing. First, no party could use my story or identity for media, marketing, or public relations purposes, even after the transaction closed, unless disclosure was required by law, a court, or a competent authority. I did not want to become a line in a press release saying the new owner had cleaned up the system. Second, diligence materials could mention Madison, the pregnancy, and the child only to the extent truly necessary to evaluate legal risk. Identifying information had to be redacted or coded. Complete medical records could not be provided without valid consent, a court order, or a separate legal basis. The third condition was the one on which I was most firm. I do not want Ethan to retain access to any preserved record, evidence, or data related to my case, I said. I also want the committee informed that allowing him to remain in control of the system creates a risk of data alteration, destruction of evidence, or witness retaliation. Maya looked at me. "We can request that Ethan be isolated from relevant data and present that risk to the independent committee," she said. "But you cannot make Ethan's termination the price of your cooperation. Personnel decisions after the transaction must belong to the committee and the buyer, based on the independent diligence findings." I was silent for a beat. "Then write it exactly that way," I said. "I do not decide what they do with Ethan, but I want them to know the precise risk of allowing him to keep touching the system." Maya nodded and added the request to the written conditions. A week later, my phone vibrated with a message from Ethan's number. It was the first message from him since the call when he screamed at me about the preservation order. "Rachel, meet with me once. Just the 2 of us, or with attorneys if you want. We need to resolve everything before the company changes hands. After that, it will be too late for both of us." The meeting took place in a conference room at a downtown dispute resolution center, a neutral room with a long wooden table and bottles of water already placed in the middle. Maya sat to my left. Ethan's attorney sat across from us. Ethan walked in 7 minutes late, exactly as he always did in meetings where he wanted to control the pace. He looked thinner than I remembered. "Rachel," he said, and his voice was the voice from our early years again, warm and full of regret. "You look healthier than I expected." I did not answer. Maya had instructed me carefully, say as little as possible and let them say as much as possible. Ethan's attorney spent about 10 minutes presenting a joint settlement offer from Ethan and Nova Life Management Services. $150,000 paid in a lump sum, plus partial payment of the medical expenses from my hospitalization. Nova Life Management Services would also formally withdraw the security complaint it had sent to my employer. It would issue a written correction stating that Nova Life no longer had grounds to accuse me of unauthorized access to its data. That would not require my company to end its internal review or immediately restore my access. But it would remove the allegation that had caused the investigation to begin. That final provision made me sit straighter. Since Ethan filed the complaint, my system access at work had remained suspended. My 12-year career was hanging on an accusation created by the man sitting across from me. And now he was offering to correct it as though it were a gift. Then they presented what they wanted in return. I had to release my civil claims against Ethan and Nova Life concerning the use, storage, and disposition of CE-17 and CD-18 to the extent permitted by law. I had to sign a statement confirming that the changes to the phone number, email address, and authentication information in my patient record had been made with my consent and at my request. I had to agree not to voluntarily contact the media or the buyer in an effort to influence the pending transaction. I also had to keep confidential the contents of the settlement and the documents exchanged during negotiations. The draft contained mandatory exceptions. No provision could prevent me from complying with a court order, a regulator, law enforcement, or a legal reporting obligation. I could still speak with Maya, my physicians, and my tax advisor. Maya had reviewed the draft 2 days earlier. She pointed out what I had also recognized on the first reading. The most valuable clause was not the confidentiality provision. It was the statement confirming that I had consented to the account changes. $150,000 was not only intended to buy my silence about the embryos. It was intended to buy a new signature that would allow Ethan to say the record changes had been authorized by me from the beginning. That signature could not erase the technical traces. It could not change the fact that I was in recovery when the electronic form was signed. It could not erase that the verification code went to Ethan's number, or that Madison's account had been used on a workstation in the finance area. But it could help Ethan characterize all those traces as administrative errors in a process I had personally approved. And more importantly, it would give him grounds to attack my credibility. I looked down at the draft for a long time, long enough for the other side to believe I was considering it. "I need time," I said. "How much?" Ethan's attorney asked. "A few weeks." I hesitated for exactly 1 beat before continuing. This was the part I had rehearsed with Maya. "And I need to know whether this number is negotiable. I'm still suspended and do not know when I will be allowed to return to work. Legal fees are not cheap either." I saw it happen right in front of me. Ethan's shoulders lowered. "Not much. Only slightly." The kind of release that comes when a person confirms that a negotiation is, after all, only about price. "We can discuss the number," he said. For the first time that day, Ethan interrupted his own attorney. The attorney turned toward him and reminded him that any change in the amount would require approval. But Ethan did not look at him. He looked at me. And that was when he began saying things he would later wish he had never said. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Rachel," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You're clinging to an embryo in a freezer." "It is there. It will stay there, and it means nothing to anyone except you." Maya remained seated beside me. She did not interrupt. I said nothing either. "Do you think I do not know what you're looking for?" Ethan continued. "You're searching for proof that someone did something to your records. Rachel, medical records are a mess. They always are. You will find hundreds of discrepancies, and then you will decide every one of them is a conspiracy. That is exactly what I have told you for years, and you still refuse to listen." Ethan knew I was investigating C-17, but he did not know we had traced the embryo to procedure room Quattro. He did not know we had seen Madison's name in the transfer order. I sat there wearing the expression of a tired woman, considering an amount of money, and let him continue. "And I am going to tell you something plainly," Ethan said, lowering his voice. "If you take this to court, I will not be the person hurt most. Madison does not know the details. She is pregnant, she is 28 years old, and she will not survive a lawsuit." He leaned forward. "Do you want to destroy another woman's life?" I still remember exactly how I felt in that moment. Ethan had just revealed 3 things. First, he admitted there were details Madison did not know. Second, he knew enough about those details to use Madison's ignorance as a shield. And third, he was willing to use her pregnancy as a reason to force me into silence. Maya did not treat those statements as a confession that could stand on its own in court. They were made during settlement negotiations, and their later use could be limited. But they told us what to look for in the next production. In 8 years of marriage, I had never held more information than Ethan in any conversation. Now I knew who had received C-17. I knew Ethan had prepared Madison's termination package. I knew he had planned to sacrifice her if the system was investigated. And Ethan believed I was bargaining for a higher price. I stood when the meeting ended. "I will think about it," I said. "Do not take too long," Ethan replied. "After the transaction closes, I will no longer be in a position to help you." I did not confront him about anything. I did not mention C-17. I did not mention the photograph of Madison in Procedure Room 4. I did not mention the 3 files in Maya's document cabinet. I only walked out of the room, took the elevator down, and sat in my car for about 10 minutes before I was calm enough to drive. 3 weeks later, Maya called when the next production had been completed. "Rachel," she said, and I heard something close to satisfaction in her voice, something I rarely heard. "Ethan sent an email to the Chief Executive Officer of Nova Life Management Services and the transaction team on the same night we met." The email had been sent from Ethan's work account through the company's system. It directly concerned Nova Life's pre-transaction risk assessment and fell within the scope of the required production. Maya read it to me. "She only wants a higher price. The embryo issue has no merit." She paused, then read the final sentence. "No need to include this in the diligence file." For the next 6 weeks, I made no new move of my own. It was the hardest thing Maya ever asked of me. No additional requests, no contact with anyone, no response to Ethan's $150,000 offer, except a brief letter from Maya stating that her client was still considering it. "We let Ethan complete his own disclosure obligations," she told me. "The more he believes everything is under control, the more likely he is to commit his story to writing." And Ethan was very busy. What I knew about the transaction during that period did not come from Lucas, because he had completely withdrawn from decision-making and no longer had access to internal information. It came from 3 sources: documents produced under the court's limited discovery order, materials Maya received through confidential diligence cooperation, and publicly disclosed information. The expected price of the transaction involving Nova Life Management Services, the management platform, non-clinical assets, and operating contracts supporting 7 facilities, was $84 million. Under the transaction structure, $21 million would be held in escrow after closing. That money would be released only according to agreed milestones, after the period for testing the representations, and after deducting claims arising from inaccurate, incomplete, or undisclosed information. The holdback was large, but not difficult to understand in a transaction carrying medical, data, and specimen management risk. It meant 1/4 of the transaction's value depended on the accuracy of the seller's representations and the certification Ethan would sign as Chief Financial Officer. According to the transaction allocation schedule and closing bonus plan produced under protective order, Ethan expected to receive a total of $9,600,000. I sat one evening calculating that number, not out of jealousy, but because I wanted to understand exactly what Ethan was wagering. $9,600,000 was enough to satisfy every obligation in any divorce settlement. Enough to buy a new house anywhere he wanted. And most important, Ethan was betting that the transaction would close before the discrepancies were discovered. Then he could leave his executive role with the transaction proceeds in hand, while the buyer dealt with the immediate operational consequences. That would not erase his responsibility, but it could make reconstructing what happened more difficult. The direct buyer was Hale Reproductive Holdings. In the ownership and conflict of interest materials provided to the seller and transaction advisors, Lucas Hale appeared as the controlling shareholder, with a note stating that he had disclosed his conflict and withdrawn from every decision related to the transaction. Ethan had been given those materials. He was required to read them because, although he was not the only person signing the purchase agreement, Ethan had to sign the Chief Financial Officer certificate, confirming that Nova Life Management Services financial information, disputes, and undisclosed liabilities were complete and accurate. I did not know whether he recognized the name, or whether if he did, he saw any connection to the woman living in a wooden house by the lake in Lake County. In Ethan's mind, I had never been someone capable of knowing anyone important. The most important part of the transaction documents was the seller's representations, warranties, and disclosure schedules. Maya printed that section separately and spread it across the table for me, line by line. Nova Life Management Services represented that there were no undisclosed investigations, claims, or disputes reasonably likely to have a material effect on operations. The management entity represented that no patient record had been improperly altered through administrative privileges under its control. It also represented that operational data, unpaid obligations, and related party transactions had been fully disclosed. Separate from those representations, Nova Life Reproductive Medical Group had to provide a clinical certification. In that certification, the clinical entity confirmed that no embryo or gamete had been used without valid consent from every person entitled to make the decision. It confirmed that the storage inventory accurately reflected the location and status of all specimens. It also confirmed that no clinical incident or chain of custody discrepancy remained undisclosed. I read those lines 3 times. Maya, do you understand what this means? I asked. I do, she said, but I want to hear you say it. Ethan is about to put his name beneath a certification we already know is false, I said. Not in an interrogation. In a commercial transaction, he is voluntarily signing to receive $9.6 million. Yes, Maya replied. If Ethan signs while knowing exceptions exist, the document becomes evidence of what he knew and what he chose not to disclose. She placed a finger on the Chief Financial Officer's certificate. What Ethan did to you may already create civil, professional, and criminal exposure, she said. But if he also signs a transaction certificate he knows is false, he creates a separate chain of commercial liability and clarifies the financial motive behind the concealment. That may open an entirely different investigative path. During preparation, the independent diligence firm already knew from the limited information Maya had provided that there was a dispute and a court order involving C-18. But it still required the seller to disclose the matter independently in the formal disclosure schedule. The question was not whether the order existed. It was whether Ethan would voluntarily disclose a risk he knew the buyer was examining. In the formal diligence questionnaire, the buyer's compliance advisor noted that a temporary order existed concerning a specimen code in the system. It asked Nova Life Management Services to confirm whether the matter had been included in the disclosure schedule. Ethan approved the seller's response. He called it a family dispute arising during a divorce. He described me as an estranged wife reacting emotionally after years of failed fertility treatment and using attorneys to apply pressure. Ethan asserted that the underlying dispute lacked substantive merit, that the court order merely preserved the status quo, and that the matter would be resolved in the divorce. He concluded that the issue created no material effect requiring disclosure on the schedule. The temporary order was not disclosed there. Dr. Victor Sloan, as medical director of Nova Life Reproductive Medical Group, signed a certification stating that clinical operations complied with consent and specimen management requirements. Madison Cole was asked to sign a 1-page acknowledgement. In it, she confirmed that she had agreed to treatment based on the information Nova Life provided and had no complaint regarding her own care. She was not given the full record. She did not see the chain of custody data. She did not see the C-17 transfer order listing the recipient. I thought about that often in the days that followed. There was one version of the story, the version I had believed for weeks, in which Madison was the woman who stole everything from me. And there was another version, the one the documents were beginning to show, in which Ethan had shown her only the parts of the record that benefited him and prepared to blame her if necessary. The documents did not prove Madison was innocent. They also did not reveal how much she truly knew. But I had once been asked to read back a verification code without seeing the full action Ethan was performing behind it. Madison had been given a 1-page acknowledgement without seeing the complete source record. Both of us had been allowed to see only the information Ethan wanted us to see. The only difference was that Madison still believed the man handing her the paper was protecting her. The final representations review meeting took place on a Wednesday afternoon at the seller's law firm. A transaction secretary created a contemporaneous record. After each group of representations, the seller's representatives had to reaffirm the contents in an updated certificate attached to the signing package. Buyer counsel went through each representation, read it aloud, and asked the seller to confirm. When he reached the provision concerning consent to embryo use, he stopped. "Mr. Morgan, I need to ask this one more time for clarity," he said. "Do you confirm that no embryo was transferred without valid and contemporaneous consent from every person entitled to decide regarding that embryo?" Ethan sat at the head of the table. In front of him was a contract more than 200 pages long. Beside it was the Chief Financial Officer's certificate, the signature line still blank. "I confirm," Ethan said. Then he picked up the pen and signed. The campaign launched during the first week of April, when Madison's pregnancy entered its 27th week. I first saw it on Nova Life's homepage, a wide banner of photographs across the screen, warm lighting, and a line of text centered over them. "Hope lives at Nova Life." Madison stood in the center image with one hand on her abdomen, smiling at the camera. She had signed a release allowing Nova Life to use her image and pregnancy story in the campaign. Beneath it was a short introduction to Madison's story, a Nova Life employee who had spent years supporting families struggling with infertility and was now preparing to welcome a child of her own. Nowhere in the campaign did it say she had undergone treatment. Instead, the story was told in a completely different way. A woman who worked every day among struggling families and then unexpectedly became pregnant naturally. The phrase used in the article was, "a surprise we were not even looking for." I read that sentence and sat still for a long time. Nova Life was using the pregnancy itself to prove a message, that hope always lived there, that the brand was stable, that the system had no cracks. That was the image the seller wanted to preserve during the final weeks before closing. 2 weeks later, Madison hosted a launch event for an infertility patient assistance fund under the Nova Life Family Foundation. Judith Morgan spoke at the event. I watched the publicly posted video that night while sitting alone in the lake house kitchen. Judith stood at the podium in the cream-colored suit she reserved for important occasions, her voice carrying the same measured tone I had heard at family dinners for 8 years. She introduced Madison as the future of the Morgan family. Judith said Ethan and I had spent years in treatment without success. Then she said Madison had brought their family something they had once believed they would never have. Finally, she added that some people bring life into a family and some people do not. It was no one's fault. It was simply how life arranged itself. I had heard that exact sentence in Judith's dining room at least 4 times across 4 different years. The only difference was that this time she said it into a microphone before an audience, and someone recorded it. I wrote no comment. I messaged no one. I did not share it, react to it, or leave any trace that I had seen it. I only captured everything, recorded the time, saved the link, and sent it to Maya. She called the next morning with a list. "Rachel, I need you to understand what this campaign just created," Maya said. "For months, we have had to verify every detail one by one. Now they have voluntarily made a series of public statements. Each one can be compared against the records we have preserved." She identified 3 categories. First was the statement describing Madison's pregnancy as entirely natural conception. Meanwhile, the procedure completion report confirmed that C17 was the only embryo transferred in Madison's procedure in room 4 at the time the pregnancy began. That did not automatically prove the genetic origin of the current pregnancy without independent testing data. But it proved that the public story omitted a significant reproductive procedure. Second was a governance and related party risk that required examination. Madison was an employee chosen as the face of a brand campaign and held a public role in the foundation, while also having a personal relationship with the seller's chief financial officer. If Ethan participated in approving Madison's role, budget, or benefits, that could create a related party transaction requiring disclosure and review. But at that point, we did not yet have documents proving Ethan had directly approved the campaign. Third was Judith's statement. She had publicly discussed my reproductive treatment history, contrasted it with Madison's pregnancy, and used that contrast at a Nova Life Family Foundation event. Judith was not my physician, and the fact that she knew information from family life did not automatically turn her speech into a medical privacy violation. But it was still a public statement about a private matter used to build Nova Life's brand narrative. We do not use this to attack them online, Maya said. We preserve it. If it needs to be provided to the diligence team, the court, or a competent authority, we will do so within the protective order, with identifying information redacted and necessary medical exhibits sealed. They may delete or correct the content, she continued, but they cannot make those statements disappear from the record after we have preserved them properly. 3 days later, I received a message. Not from Ethan, from Madison. It was the first message she had sent me since the day I left the house. Rachel, I know things between us are difficult, but I want to invite you to the fundraiser next month. I think it would mean something for you to see how this fund is helping women like you. There is no hostility in this. I truly mean it. I read it 3 times. Even now, I cannot say what Madison meant by it. It may have been a provocation wrapped in polite paper. It may have been a need to see me accept her new position. Or perhaps, and this possibility disturbed me most, she genuinely believed she was doing something kind. I sent the message to Maya before doing anything else. Do not answer, she said immediately. Not one word. But preserve it. This is voluntary contact from Madison, and evidence that she personally invited you to the event. Do not treat it as official permission from Nova Life or the Foundation until we verify the authority under which she sent the invitation. I had not decided whether to attend. I also would not go unless Maya evaluated the full risk and agreed on a specific plan with me. That evening, I sat on Lucas's porch and told him I was considering attending. Lucas was silent for a long time. You do not need to appear there to prove that you are strong, he said at last. You remained silent while their own public statements created more questions. You do not need to walk into an auditorium full of their people to prove anything. I know, I replied. Then why? I thought about the question for a long time before answering, because I needed to be certain my reason was not something I would regret. For 5 years, I had sat in rooms where other people talked about my body. Doctors discussed my ovarian response with Ethan while I lay on the table. Judith discussed my fertility at dinner without looking at me, speaking about me in the third person. Ethan used codes sent to his phone to complete forms while I was still in recovery after procedures. Then he told Nora I had agreed to transfer sedated, even though no one had ever asked me. And now an organization was hosting an event to speak about women like me, represented by the very woman who had received sedated. I am not going so they can see me, I said. I am going so they cannot keep speaking for me. Lucas nodded. He did not try to change my mind again. 4 days before the event, Maya called me at 7 in the morning. I knew immediately something had happened because she had never called before 8. The independent compliance advisor just completed an expanded review, she said. After finding 3 technical indicators appearing together in my record, the compliance advisor requested permission to run a de-identified query across the entire system. Nova Life Reproductive Medical Group was notified of the proposed scope. The court then authorized the independent forensic firm to conduct a limited query solely to determine how many records shared the same pattern. No one was allowed to open patient names. No one was allowed to view full clinical records. The initial result displayed only the number of flagged records and technical reference codes. The forensic firm searched for 3 signs appearing in the same cycle. Contact information changed shortly before a procedure. An electronic signature certificate missing send or open history. And a specimen status changed and then restored within a short time. I got out of bed. Rachel, Maya said, the query flagged 17 records including yours. I said nothing. 16 other records have the same 3 indicators, she said. We do not yet know how many involve wrongdoing. But this is no longer an isolated discrepancy. The independent forensic firm delivered the 68-page report to Maya's office on Friday afternoon, under the court's protective order. The report used only de-identified reference codes and technical data fields within the approved query scope. No patient names. No contact information. No complete treatment records for the other 16 people. I spent 4 hours reading it in the conference room, with an independent embryology expert beside me to explain the parts requiring clinical expertise. He also worked under the protective order and had access only to the limited data in the report. The first thing I need to make clear is that the report did not claim there had been 17 unauthorized embryo transfers. It said something far more cautious. Across the 7-facility network, 17 patient records showed anomalies requiring further review by competent authorities. The 3 technical indicators used in the initial query led the forensic firm to 4 categories of discrepancies requiring deeper analysis. The first category involved contact information in a patient record being changed shortly before a significant procedure. The second involved consent forms completed only after a laboratory order had already been issued for action, or after a specimen had begun moving out of storage status. That sequence did not automatically prove wrongdoing, but it required review to determine whether the process had begun before valid consent existed. The third category involved specimen codes manually altered in the display layer without a corresponding record in the backend layer. The fourth involved records missing confirmation by a second verifier or an equivalent electronic witnessing system, as required by Novolife's approved procedures for critical specimen handling steps. Some of these 17 cases are almost certainly administrative errors, the expert told me, pointing to the classification table. A staff member entered something incorrectly, the system synchronized slowly, or the process was performed properly but documented out of sequence. Those things can happen in any healthcare system. How many are most concerning? I asked. He turned to the final page of the analysis. 3 records contain all 4 categories of indicators at the same time, he said. Yours is one of them. These are the 3 records assigned the highest priority for investigation. They are not 3 cases already determined to involve unauthorized embryo transfers. I sat with that number for a long time. For months, I had lived with a very clear story in my head. My husband had done this to me. It was a personal story with one wrongdoer, one victim, and one goal: to make him answer for what he had done to me. That 68-page report shattered the story completely. There were 2 other patients out there. 2 people I had never met, whose names and faces I did not know. They might be living normally and never have suspected anything. One of them might also have spent years believing her body was the thing that had failed. And there were 14 others, in records where no one dared say something had happened, but no one could confidently say everything was fine. How will those people find out? I asked Maya. She shook her head, then explained carefully. Not by publishing this report, Maya said. If it became public right now, what would happen to those 16 people? I did not answer immediately because I understood before she finished. The press would descend on them, Maya continued. They would try to identify the patients. In a 7-facility network, narrowing people down is not as difficult as most imagine when you have even a few details about time and place. Some people in those 16 records have families and children, and may never have told anyone they underwent fertility treatment. We would destroy their privacy to serve your case without ever asking them. Exactly what was done to me, I said. Exactly, Maya replied. Instead, she did something entirely different. Maya asked the court for permission to provide limited summaries to competent authorities while keeping the protective order over patient data in place. Over the next week, her office prepared 3 separate document packages. Each package contained only the minimum information the recipient needed to exercise its authority. The first went to the state health agencies with jurisdiction over facility licensing and laboratory operations at the relevant locations. The initial submission contained only confidential record codes and descriptions of the types of anomalies. The forensic firm separately retained the identity crosswalk. Regulators could request that specific codes be opened only for records requiring review under their authority and confidentiality procedures. The second package went to the independent accrediting body that certified laboratories in the Novolife network. That body could open a certification review, require a corrective action plan, and reconsider or suspend accreditation if Novolife failed to cooperate. It also received confidential record codes, but not a list of patient names in the initial notice. The third package went to the buyer's independent compliance advisor, not to influence the transaction. But because this was a material risk, the transaction committee had to evaluate under the agreements and diligence process. The buyer received only an anonymized aggregate report. No patient names. No codes capable of revealing identities. No individual medical records. We have not turned a technical report into a criminal accusation, Maya said when I asked whether anyone would be arrested. First, we give it to the authorities empowered to verify it. If the data reaches the threshold for a criminal matter, the regulators may refer it, or we will make a separate report through the proper channel. That can take months. If we try to force the timing, every later step can be challenged. Meanwhile, on the other side, Ethan was racing the clock. I knew that from internal communications falling within the required production. He repeatedly pressured Nova Life's chief executive officer, finance team, integration group, and transaction team to complete the remaining conditions before closing. Ethan cited different reasons involving market conditions and operating costs. But he wrote one reason explicitly in an email to the CEO and the transaction team. The transaction had to close before Madison began maternity leave. I read that line many times. I could not know exactly what Ethan feared would happen after the child was born. Childbirth did not automatically make medical records public. A birth certificate, hospital records, and newborn testing also did not automatically prove the origin of the pregnancy. But Madison's maternity leave would create additional personnel records, dependent benefit decisions, insurance records, and internal decisions concerning her relationship with Ethan. Attention to the publicity campaign would also increase. And every new layer of information created another opportunity for someone to ask a question that the story of a completely natural pregnancy would make harder to control. The launch of the new Nova Life was scheduled for June 19th, provided the transaction closed as previously planned. The accrediting body's preliminary findings report following its urgent review was expected to be released on the 18th. It was not the final report, but it could impose temporary action requirements, open a deeper review, or force the transaction parties to reevaluate the representations they had signed. Maya called me the evening she received the release schedule. "Rachel," she said, "do you understand what this means?" I looked through the window at the black surface of the lake. It meant that exactly one day before Ethan stepped onto a stage to announce a new chapter for thousands of families, the preliminary findings report would go to Nova Life Reproductive Medical Group, the competent regulators, the accrediting body, and the buyer's independent committee. One day before the launch of the $84 million transaction. 6 months had passed since the afternoon Lucas found me unconscious on the porch. During those 6 months, I had learned many things about him, but one thing became clear before everything else. Lucas had never contacted the forensic firm directly, never participated in strategic discussions between Maya and me, and never once asked to see any document from the case. When Maya needed to ask Lucas a technical question, she sent it separately, limited it to information he was entitled to provide, and attached no confidential materials. Lucas provided only a list of publicly known experts in the field. Maya conducted her own conflict checks, selected them herself, and retained them directly through an independent process. He did not pay their fees. He did not control the scope of their work. He did not see results before I did. Lucas was also never my treating physician. He called emergency services when he found me unconscious, but took no part in any later medical care decision. He explained the parts of the system he was entitled to explain. But every personal decision was mine after receiving Maya's advice. Once I asked why he had to be so rigid. "Because if I acted differently, someday you might look back and not know which decisions were yours," he said. In mid-July, I received a letter from my company's human resources department. The review was over. The security complaint submitted by Nova Life Management Services had been rejected in full. The report concluded there was no evidence that I had used my employer's systems to access Nova Life data without authorization. Nova Life's corrective letter also confirmed that the activity it had cited was actually my access to my own patient records. I read the letter 3 times before believing it. For 6 months, I had been unable to log into the system where I'd worked for 12 years. I had lived with the possibility that even if Ethan were held accountable, I might never get my career back. On my first day back, I sat in front of the login screen for about 30 seconds before typing my password. Not because I was afraid, because I needed a moment to remember the feeling. That evening, Lucas and I had dinner at a small restaurant about a 20-minute drive from the lake. It was not a planned date. Only two people at the end of a long day who did not want to cook. He was quieter than usual through the first half of dinner. "What's wrong?" I asked. Lucas set down his fork. "When I saw Novalife turn Madison's pregnancy into a publicity campaign, my first reaction was not to think about the people who had been harmed," he said. "My first reaction was to calculate how the campaign might weaken the seller's position. I spent about 40 seconds doing that before I realized what I was doing." I said nothing and let him continue. "I left day-to-day operations 2 years ago because I could not stand conference rooms where people discuss patients as if they were a line of revenue," he said. "But the truth is that I sat in those rooms for years. I know how they think because I once thought the same way. And I am afraid that if I stay close to this long enough, I will become someone who solves everything with power again, even while believing he is doing the right thing." I sat in silence for a long time, then said what I had been thinking for weeks but had not spoken aloud. "Lucas, I do not need a man who can destroy Ethan," I said. "If that were what I needed, I already had one." "Ethan always believed he was solving everything for me too. He handled the money, he handled the paperwork, he entered the verification codes. He decided when I should stop. Every time Ethan handled something for me, I lost another part of my authority over my own life." Lucas looked at me. "What I need is someone who does not decide for me," I said, "and for the past 6 months, you are the only person who has done that." We sat in silence for a length of time I could not measure. Then I leaned across the table and kissed him. "I need to make this clear because it matters more to me than almost any other detail in the entire story. I initiated it, not Lucas. In 6 months, he had not once crossed a boundary I had not drawn first." Later, while we sat in the car in the parking lot, I told him honestly what I could and could not offer at that time. They were not terms of a bargain. They were boundaries I needed so I would not lose myself again. I was not ready to return to any form of fertility treatment. Maybe never. My body had endured 6 stimulation cycles, 7 embryo transfers, and a hospitalization for a hemorrhagic ovarian cyst during treatment. I did not want anyone, including myself, to place another expectation on it. I was also not ready to promise marriage or any fixed future. Not because of Lucas. Because I had just lost 8 years in a marriage where documents were used as weapons, and I needed time to understand what I wanted when no one was waiting for me to sign something. Finally, I did not want our relationship mixed with the lawsuit, the transaction, or Novalife. I would not share case documents with Lucas. We would not discuss legal strategy or transaction strategy. Lucas would not use his shareholder role to influence the case. And I would not accept financial support or legal expenses from him. Lucas listened to all of it. "All right." Yeah, he said. "No conditions. No but. No promise about how long he would wait for me, which I knew could be a very subtle way of putting pressure on another person. Only all right." Then Lucas asked whether I wanted to stop for coffee on the way home. The next morning, I told Maya that my relationship with Lucas had changed. Lucas also updated his conflict disclosure with counsel for the independent committee. From that point on, he remained excluded from all information, documents, and decisions related to the transaction. Maya documented that the forensic protocol preservation orders and most of the core evidence had been established before our romantic relationship began. But we kept every boundary in place. No exceptions. 3 days later, at 10 that night, Maya called. I knew from her voice that this was the call we had waited 6 months to receive. "Rachel, the final forensic report concerning C16, C17, C18, and the forms bearing your name is complete," Maya said. "The report contains the complete data chain of custody, testing methodology, and the expert's sworn declaration. We can submit it under the court's procedures, and the judge will decide whether to admit it into evidence." I sat down on the front steps, just as I had the first time she called about C17. "The first conclusion on the list," Maya said, and I heard paper turning on the other end. "There is no data authenticating you as the person who created or approved the signature on the form." She paused. "That signature cannot be attributed to Rachel Morgan." 4 weeks before Maya's call, on the morning of Tuesday, June 17th, Ethan signed the transaction representations one final time. It was not the initial signing of the purchase agreement. The agreement had already been signed. This was the pre-closing review and execution of updated certificates, held at the seller's law firm's office on the 31st floor of a glass building downtown. I was not there. I had no role in the transaction, and Maya had made clear that even appearing in the same building could be characterized as pressure. What I know about that morning came from the contemporaneous minutes, the signed updated certificates, and the electronic document issuance records. Those materials were later produced through proper procedures and became part of the case record. 14 people were in the room. Ethan Morgan, as Chief Financial Officer and signatory to certifications concerning disclosure, finances, and unlisted obligations of Novalife Management Services. Dr. Victor Sloan, Medical Director of Novalife Reproductive Medical Group. 2 shareholder representatives. 4 attorneys for the seller. 3 attorneys for the buyer. 2 financial advisors. And 1 recording secretary. The buyer was identified throughout the documents as Hale Reproductive Holdings. In the ownership and conflict of interest exhibit provided to the seller, Lucas Hale was identified as the controlling shareholder. His name appeared on page 47 of the exhibit, with a note stating that he had disclosed a conflict of interest and was excluded from every decision related to the transaction. Ethan signed an acknowledgement that he had received and reviewed the exhibits relevant to his certifications. Later, after everything ended, I still sometimes thought about that moment. Ethan knew who Lucas Hale was to the extent the transaction documents described him, a reproductive endocrinologist from the founding family who had left day-to-day operations 2 years earlier and was not involved in buyer decisions concerning this transaction. To someone like Ethan, that described an heir who had stepped away from the business, not a threat. And for 8 years, I had never been someone he believed could know anyone important. The review began at 9 o'clock. Before the updated certificates were signed, the seller's disclosure team issued a memorandum concerning open matters. The memorandum was distributed to both sides and attached to the meeting minutes. It stated 3 things. First, a court order preserving the status quo regarding C-18 was currently in effect, and the underlying dispute remained unresolved. Second, the document preparation process had identified unresolved questions concerning the consent system, administrative data privileges, and the process for preserving internal warnings. Third, the disclosure team recommended postponing recertification for 72 hours to complete the review and supplement the disclosure schedule if necessary. That was sound professional advice. The people who prepared the memorandum did exactly what they were supposed to do. Ethan refused. According to the minutes, he said the underlying dispute lacked substantive merit, that the court order only preserved the status quo as to C-18, and that it did not create a material effect requiring delay. He said any delay could cause the buyer to reconsider the price. And he reminded everyone that the parties had spent 11 months reaching that point. If Ethan had accepted the 72-hour delay, recertification would have occurred after the accrediting body's preliminary findings report was issued. I do not know whether he knew the exact release schedule. Perhaps he only sensed that time was moving against him. But whatever the reason, Ethan was the person who rejected the final opportunity to correct the disclosure schedule before signing. Recertification began at 9:40. Buyer counsel read each group of Novalife Management Services governance representations aloud and asked Ethan to confirm them. First group, the disclosure schedule fully identified every investigation, claim, dispute, and court order known to the seller that could materially affect operations or the transaction. The buyer already knew a dispute existed from the limited summary Maya had provided to diligence. But the question here was whether the seller itself had placed the matter on the formal disclosure schedule. Ethan confirmed the schedule was complete. Second group, no patient record had been improperly altered through administrative system privileges controlled by Novalife Management Services. Ethan confirmed. Third group, No related party transaction had been concealed in any activity, payment, or benefit within the entity's management scope. Ethan confirmed. Fourth group. All internal warnings and incidents received by Novalife Management Services had been preserved, processed, or disclosed under applicable procedures. Ethan confirmed. Fifth group. Financial information, unpaid obligations, closing bonuses, and transaction-related expenses had been presented completely and accurately. Ethan confirmed. Sixth group. The disclosure schedule had been updated through the time of certification, and no other material matter known to Ethan remained undisclosed. Ethan confirmed. Then he signed all 6 groups. Dr. Victor Sloan signed a separate clinical certificate on behalf of Novalife Reproductive Medical Group. He certified that embryo and gamete use was based on valid consent from the people entitled to decide. He certified that the storage inventory accurately reflected the location and status of the specimens. He certified compliance with chain of custody, second witness, or equivalent electronic witnessing requirements. And he certified that every material clinical incident had been disclosed. Madison Cole was not present at the signing. She was in the final weeks of her pregnancy. 1 week earlier, Madison had signed a 1-page form confirming only that she voluntarily provided the images and personal content used in the media campaign. That document did not certify the origin of the pregnancy. It did not certify the validity of the C-17 transfer. And it did not prove Madison knew where the embryo transferred to her had come from. Recertification ended at 11:20, but the transaction had not yet closed. The purchase agreement had been signed, but closing could occur only after the remaining conditions were satisfied and the updated certificates were accepted. Before closing, ownership and control of Novalife Management Services had not transferred to Hale Reproductive Holdings. The buyer's transition team could only prepare continuity plans under a limited protocol. It could review plans for power security, liquid nitrogen supply, technical staffing, and temperature monitoring systems. But it had not taken over the system. It could not change access rights. And it had no authority to operate the clinical activities of Novalife Reproductive Medical Group. Even after closing, Hale Reproductive Holdings would acquire only Novalife Management Services, the management platform, non-clinical assets, and contracts supporting the 7 facilities. Clinical decisions would remain with Novalife Reproductive Medical Group. The purchase price had not been released to the seller. If the transaction closed, $21 million would continue to be held in escrow to secure indemnity obligations and claims arising from inaccurate, incomplete, or undisclosed information. Ethan's entire expected payment of $9,600,000 still depended on closing and satisfaction of the payment conditions. A significant portion remained affected by the escrow and by the representations he had just reaffirmed. There is one more thing I need to make clear because many people misunderstand it when they hear this story. A change in company ownership did not automatically give me exclusive authority over C-18. No provision in the contract said C-18 would be released to me. No mechanism turned the new owner into my personal protector. The court status quo order was still what prevented C-18 from being moved, used, destroyed, or having its status changed, while the dispute remained unresolved. And that order would remain in effect until the court ruled otherwise. At 11:20 that morning, control of the data had not transferred to the buyer. Ethan had not been removed from the system simply because he signed. The only thing that had changed was his evidentiary position. Ethan had been informed that unresolved issues existed. He had been advised to delay. He had an opportunity to supplement the disclosure schedule. And he still placed his name beneath 6 certifications that no material fact remained hidden. On the morning of June 18th, the independent accrediting body issued its preliminary findings report following the urgent review. The report went to Novalife Reproductive Medical Group, the competent regulators, the compliance advisor, and the buyer's independent committee. It was not the final forensic report on C-16, C-17, and C-18. That final report would not be complete until mid-July. But the document issued on the morning of June 18th reached the very people with authority to decide whether the $84 million transaction could still close the next day. I read the preliminary findings report on the night of June 18th, sitting at the kitchen table in the lake house with Maya on speakerphone. She explained the legal and procedural meaning of each finding. The technical sections had been annotated by the forensic expert in the appendix. The first thing that surprised me was how dry it was. For months, I had imagined this moment in a completely different way. I had pictured forceful language, definitive conclusions, a document naming Ethan Morgan and declaring him a criminal. There was nothing like that in the report. It did not call anyone a criminal. It did not use the word fraud. It made no criminal allegation. It simply presented, in order, what the data showed and what Novalife had not been able to explain with documentation. Finding 1. The consent signature on the electronic form completed on the day C-17 was transferred did not satisfy Novalife's stated authentication process because the record lacked evidence that the form had been sent and opened on the patient's device. Finding 2. The verification code for that form was sent to a phone number the system identified as Ethan Morgan's, not to a contact number under my control. Finding 3. C-17 had been scanned out of storage and entered the procedure workflow before the electronic consent form was completed. Finding 4. The back-end record identified Madison Cole as the recipient of C-17. Finding 5. The data showed C-18 was moved from primary storage to an auxiliary storage tank, but the examined records contain no corresponding clinical order, reconciliation report, or patient notification. Finding 6. Nora's exception report and the related technical alerts were closed or marked resolved without complete supporting documentation under Novalife's procedures. Finding 7. 16 other patient records shared the same technical indicators and required further evaluation by competent authorities. The report did not say those 16 records represented 16 unauthorized embryo transfers. It did not conclude who had performed each action or who bore legal responsibility. And the final section contained a limitation I had requested from the beginning. The report included no genetic information concerning the ongoing pregnancy and made no conclusion about the genetic origin or legal status of the child to be born. Maya, do you think it is strong enough? I asked. Rachel, it is strong precisely because it does not try to sound strong, she said. A report written in emotional language would be attacked immediately by opposing counsel. This report only says, this is the data. This is the process Novalife said it followed, and these are the points that do not match. They can argue about cause, interpretation, or individual responsibility, Maya continued, but they must explain every inconsistency with data. They cannot make the back-end records disappear. What happened over the next 12 hours happened very quickly, and no one shouted. The buyer's independent committee issued notice that the conditions to closing had not been satisfied. The notice specifically cited 4 of the 6 groups of representations Ethan had reaffirmed the day before and reserved all of the buyer's contractual rights. The closing was postponed. Not $1 of the purchase price was released to the seller. The $21 million escrow was not funded because the transaction had not closed. The full $9,600,000 Ethan expected to receive remained beyond his reach. Novalife Management Services Independent Committee suspended Ethan from all transaction-related duties. At the recommendation of the compliance advisor and forensic firm, Ethan's administrative privileges capable of altering, deleting, or overwriting data were also temporarily locked to preserve evidence. Ethan had not been fired. The buyer did not yet control the company. But from that moment on, he was no longer permitted to touch systems capable of changing the records under review. Novalife Reproductive Medical Group's independent clinical board suspended Dr. Victor Sloan's administrative access and specimen disposition approval authority, while the accrediting body and regulators conducted their reviews. His license was not revoked. He was not charged. His data and specimen-related authority was only suspended pending further findings. And Nora Kim was placed under anti-retaliation protection. That was something I asked Maya to request as soon as the report was issued. Nora had opened an exception report through the proper process, sent an internal email to compliance, and later had her work responsibilities changed. Nova Life Reproductive Medical Group issued a directive preserving Nora's personnel records, pausing any related adverse action and prohibiting retaliation during the investigation. That did not prove Nora had been retaliated against, but it ensured no one could continue changing her position before the issue was fully examined. She still did not contact me. I did not expect her to. That afternoon, Maya received a call neither of us anticipated. It came from an attorney at a different law firm representing a new client. Madison Cole. After Nova Life's independent committee reviewed potential conflicts, Madison was informed that the company files contained a draft assigning responsibility to her and a termination package prepared in December. Madison's independent employment attorney received excerpts directly relevant to her interests under a confidentiality agreement. Madison's attorney has not taken a position on cooperation, Maya said. They have only notified us that from this point forward, every communication concerning Madison's personal rights, pregnancy, or employment must go through their office. Nova Life's legal department represents the organization, she continued. It has never been Madison's personal counsel. I understood what that meant. Madison had just realized that the attorneys she believed were protecting her had obligations only to the company. Ethan called me at 11 that night. Then at 11:14. Then at 11:28. Then at midnight. I did not answer any of the calls. He left 3 voice messages. Maya listened to all 3 before I did, under the process we had agreed on months earlier. Here's the summary, she told me the next morning. In the first message, Ethan says he knows you are behind all of this and cannot believe you went this far. In the second, he says you are destroying the lives of many innocent people, including Madison. In the third, he says you will regret not taking the $150,000. Anything else? Yes, Maya said. In all 3 messages, he never once denies any finding in the report. Ethan's failure to deny them was not a confession. Maya did not treat it as one. But to me, it showed that what mattered most to him was not whether the data was true or false. He was only angry that I had not remained silent. Maya preserved the original recordings and timestamp data, then sent Ethan notice demanding that he end all direct contact with me. I sat with that for a long time. For 6 months, I had prepared myself for every scenario. Ethan would deny everything, offer an intricate explanation, or find a weakness in the data we had missed. I had not prepared for this scenario. He did not try to explain. He was only angry that I had not taken the money. On the morning of June 19th, I woke at 6. The Future of Nova Life event was still scheduled to begin at 10 at a downtown convention center. The organizers had not announced a cancellation or program change, even though the closing had been postponed. The guest list included investors, physicians in the field, representatives of patient organizations, and specialized healthcare press. The program had been printed and sent to guests 2 weeks earlier. It still listed Ethan Morgan in the opening remarks, identified him as Chief Financial Officer, and included the title of his speech, The Architecture of a New Future. On the morning of June 19th, I put on a white blouse and gray slacks, the same kind of clothes I had worn to work every day for 12 years. I had thought about it for a long time the night before. There was a version of that morning in which I entered the auditorium in an expensive suit, with my hair carefully styled, looking like a woman who had risen above everything. But I understood that if I did that, I would be playing the same game Ethan and Judith had played for years, measuring a person's worth by what she wore. I was not going there to look richer than they did. I was going as a patient. Maya came with me. After the closing was postponed, the independent committee responsible for the event decided not to cancel it. Instead, it converted the launch into an informational session on operational continuity, patient safety, and the ongoing review process. A patient representative group asked me to speak about my own experience. Maya agreed only after the organizers confirmed in writing that my participation was entirely voluntary. There would be no questions, and I would determine the content. She reviewed every sentence of the speech. I could speak only about my own records and consent rights. No disclosure of material subject to the protective order. No naming Madison. No discussion of the pregnancy. No information concerning the child. We entered through the guest entrance, presented an invitation confirmed by the independent committee, and sat in the fourth row from the back on the left side. There were about 200 people in the auditorium. Investors sat near the stage. Physicians in the field were scattered through the middle. A small group of patient organization representatives sat toward the back. About 10 healthcare trade reporters stood along the right wall. Lucas arrived at 9:45. He entered alone and sat in the shareholder section, separate from the transaction committee members. Lucas had been excluded from every transaction decisions. He did not speak for the buyer. He did not participate in changing the program. He did not communicate with me at the event. Ethan saw me at 9:52. I watched him stop in the aisle beside the stage, stare directly at me for about 3 seconds, then turn and say something to a nearby security officer. The officer approached us. Maya stood before he reached our seats. "Good morning, we are authorized guests," she said, presenting the invitation. "You can confirm that with the organizers." He took the invitation, spoke into his radio, and waited about 40 seconds. Then he handed it back to Maya. "I apologize for the interruption," he said. "The independent committee confirms that both of you are valid guests." He returned to Ethan and spoke briefly. I was too far away to hear, but I saw Ethan's face when he realized he no longer decided who was allowed to sit in that room. In the second row, Madison turned around. She saw Lucas in the shareholder section. Then she saw me. We looked at each other for about 2 seconds. Neither of us nodded. Neither of us spoke. I do not know what Madison thought in that moment. The event began at 10. The program had been printed 2 weeks earlier and still listed Ethan Morgan as the opening speaker. But the moderator took the stage and announced that Ethan's remarks had been canceled because the transaction had not closed, and he had been suspended from all duties related to the transition. Ethan stood in the aisle beside the stage. He did not move. The chair of Hale Reproductive Holdings Independent Transaction Committee was invited to the podium. Her remarks lasted less than 4 minutes. She did not mention my name. She did not mention any pregnancy. She made no allegation against Ethan, Madison, or Dr. Sloan. She stated 3 things. First, the acquisition of Nova Life Management Services had not closed, and ownership had not transferred to Hale Reproductive Holdings. Second, the preliminary findings report issued on the morning of June 18th raised material questions concerning several representations the seller had reaffirmed before closing. Therefore, the conditions to close the transaction had not been satisfied. Third, under preservation directives issued by Nova Life Management Services and Nova Life Reproductive Medical Group, administrative privileges capable of altering, deleting, or overwriting the data under review had been temporarily locked. An independent review within a scope approved by competent authorities was underway. Patients identified as requiring notice would be contacted directly and privately by Nova Life Reproductive Medical Group under the supervision of the accrediting body and relevant regulators. Then the moderator invited a representative of the patient group to the stage. She said, "With the consent of counsel and at the request of the patient representative group, we have invited Rachel Morgan to speak about her own experience. Her participation is entirely voluntary. There will be no question and answer session." I stood and walked to the stage. I carried no documents, no file, no printout, no phone. Maya and I had agreed on that the night before. I would hold nothing in my hand so no one could say I had displayed material covered by the protective order at a public event. I stood before the microphone and spoke for about 2 minutes. "My name is Rachel Morgan," I said. "I was a patient in this network for 5 years." The auditorium became completely silent. In my final treatment cycle, 3 embryos were created from my eggs. 1 embryo was transferred to me under the treatment plan. I never consented to another embryo being transferred to another patient. I paused. A form changing information and disposition authority in my record was completed, while I was still recovering from a procedure. Another electronic confirmation was later used in the process of releasing an embryo. The available data cannot authenticate me as the person who created or approved that confirmation. I am not standing here to discuss my family, my marriage, or any other individual. I am not here to discuss any pregnancy. No child is part of the story I'm telling today, and I will not answer any public question on that subject. I looked down at the auditorium. I have only one request. Every patient whose record competent authorities determine requires review must be contacted directly and privately. They must be told what was found and given complete copies of their treatment records, consent forms, and chain of custody data to which they are lawfully entitled. For 5 years, the records provided to me did not reflect the complete consent history, chain of custody, and modification logs recorded by the system. If I had been allowed to see those parts sooner, I would not have had to stand here. I left the stage. There was no applause. I did not expect any. As I stepped off the last stair, Ethan came out from the side aisle. He was holding a thick stack of papers I recognized immediately. A copy of the purchase agreement. 2 security officers began moving toward him. Ethan raised the agreement high enough for the people in the front rows to see. "The contract was signed," he said loudly. "You cannot withdraw from the transaction because of one preliminary report." I did not turn around. The chair of the Independent Transaction Committee answered him. "No one is withdrawing from a completed transaction, Mr. Morgan," she said. "The transaction is not closed." She looked directly at him. "The closing conditions have not been satisfied because the representations you personally reaffirmed can no longer be accepted as accurate." The entire auditorium was silent after that sentence. Lucas said nothing more to humiliate Ethan. He remained seated in the shareholder section, did not approach the stage, and did not participate in the committee's decision. The chair of the Independent Transaction Committee continued the explanation. "Mr. Morgan, the agreement you are holding was signed," she said, "but the transaction has not closed." She paused. "The preliminary findings report does not automatically terminate the agreement. It means the conditions to closing can no longer be certified as satisfied." Then she listed 3 things slowly, so everyone in the room could follow. First, the entire purchase price remained with the paying agent and had not been released to the seller. If the transaction later closed, $21 million would be held in escrow under the agreed terms, or terms modified after the review. Second, Nova Life Management Services Independent Committee had suspended Ethan from every transaction-related duty. The buyer had also stated that it would accept no further certification or direction from him during the continued evaluation. Third, Hale Reproductive Holdings had reserved all contractual rights and remedies. Those rights included demanding a cure, supplementing the disclosure schedule, changing the closing conditions, restructuring the transaction, or terminating it if the conditions were not satisfied. "Ownership of Nova Life Management Services has not transferred," she said, "but Nova Life has temporarily locked your administrative privileges, capable of altering, deleting, or overwriting preserved data." I sat in the 4th row and watched the moment Ethan understood. Not that he had lost. He had sensed that the night before. What Ethan understood in that moment was how he had put himself there. For 6 months, Ethan had believed the transaction was his escape. He believed that if it closed before the discrepancies were verified, he could leave his executive position with $9,600,000, while other people handled the operational consequences. He had pressured the transaction team to move faster. He had rejected the recommendation to delay 72 hours. He had reaffirmed 6 groups of representations, despite being told unresolved issues remained. Ethan had not sold evidence to Lucas. He had signed a contract requiring him to certify that the system containing that evidence had no undisclosed material exceptions. He had tied his expected payment to the accuracy of those certifications. And while Ethan signed, the court order, the independent forensic firm, and the preservation directives had placed the source data beyond his control. Not because Lucas arranged it. The transaction began 11 months before Lucas knew I existed. As soon as Maya formally notified the buyer of the dispute, Lucas disclosed his conflict and withdrew from every transaction decision. Ethan chose when to sign. Ethan rejected the advice. Ethan placed the pen on every line himself. As for Novalife Reproductive Medical Group, its clinical board appointed an interim medical leader and accepted outside oversight by the accrediting body while regulators conducted their review. A representative of the clinical board came to the stage to address the patients in the auditorium. "Patient care and specimen preservation remain operational," she said. "No disruption has been reported in backup power, liquid nitrogen replenishment schedules, or temperature monitoring systems. All essential technical personnel remain on duty. Ordinary delete and overwrite privileges for preserved data have been disabled. Every remaining privileged access is logged and independently monitored." No one said Madison Cole's name on the stage. Not once. Not in the transaction committee's announcement. Not in my speech. Not in any document distributed to the press. Maya had requested that in the protective order, and the organizers and relevant parties agreed not to disclose Madison's name or any information that could identify the pregnancy. The meeting afterward had been arranged in advance by the two law firms. It took place in a small conference room downstairs after the event, under a limited confidentiality agreement. There were 4 people: me, Maya, Madison, and Madison's own attorney. Madison attended voluntarily. Maya did not represent her. There was no press. There was no hidden recording device. Maya placed 3 documents on the table after redacting unnecessary information. They had been provided to Madison's attorney under the court's authorization and the parties' confidentiality agreement. Not the entire file. Only 3 things. First was the activity log showing that the request to change contact information in my patient record had been made with an administrative account associated with Madison Cole. The network log showed the session originated from a workstation on the 12th floor in the finance executive area, not the 4th floor where Madison worked. The data did not identify who sat at the computer. It proved only that the session did not originate in Madison's ordinary work area. Second was Ethan's draft letter to Human Resources proposing a review of all Madison's administrative activity over 18 months. Third was the prepared termination package, created in December. Madison read all 3 in silence. Her attorney read beside her and took notes. She was approximately 37 weeks pregnant. Her hand remained on her abdomen the entire time she read. When she finished, Madison did not cry. She only looked up at me, and the first thing she said was not an apology. "What do you want?" I had prepared for that question for weeks, and I answered exactly what I had written in my notebook. "I want the child to be safe," I said. "After that, I want the truth handled by people with authority to do so." "That's all? That's all?" "I am not asking you to do anything for me. Months ago, I asked Maya to propose a process so you could be informed of your right to independent counsel, protected from retaliation, and able to request confidentiality for necessary medical records. If your medical records become necessary in the litigation, Maya will ask the court to limit the scope, redact identifying information, and seal the necessary portions. The final decision belongs to the judge." Madison was silent for a long time. Then she turned to her attorney and spoke quietly. The attorney nodded. "I will preserve my phone," Madison said. "My attorney will retain a forensic expert to create a limited copy of all communications between Ethan and me over the past 18 months. Unrelated data, medical records, and privileged communications will be screened before anything is produced." Maya nodded. Everything would go through Madison's attorney. No device was handed to me. No data was transferred directly to Maya in that room. Madison stood to leave, then stopped at the door. "I knew I was receiving an embryo transfer," she said without turning toward me, "but I did not know C17 was created from your egg or came from your treatment record." "Ethan told me it was a donated embryo from a couple who had completed treatment and agreed to transfer its use." I did not know whether Madison was telling the truth. I still do not know. That explanation may describe what Ethan told her about C17's source, but it did not explain everything. Madison knew she had undergone an embryo transfer. She still agreed to appear in a campaign describing the pregnancy as a completely natural surprise. "I did not ask to see the source records," she said. Then she paused again. And I knew the campaign story was not true. I let them tell it that way. That was not an admission that she knew C-17's origin. But it was not complete innocence either. Madison left with her attorney. Ethan was not arrested on the stage. There were no handcuffs. No police rushed into the auditorium. There was no dramatic moment like the ones I had imagined during sleepless nights. Convention Center security escorted him out after he disrupted the program. Later, Nova Life Security supervised Ethan's departure from the administrative area and the surrender of company equipment under the independent committee's suspension decision. He had not been convicted. He had not been arrested. And no final determination had been made regarding his responsibility. The competent authorities continued evaluating the materials under their own schedules and standards, on other days and in other places where no cameras were present. I drove home that afternoon and sat for a long time on the steps overlooking the lake. For 6 months, I had imagined this moment hundreds of times, and in every version I had pictured, I was shouting something in Ethan's face. But in the end, I never had to shout at him once. Ethan did not begin to collapse because I spoke louder. His version of the truth began to collapse because every system he had altered eventually preserved the original. Madison gave birth in early July, a little more than 2 weeks after the convention center event. I learned through a brief email from her attorney to Maya, in accordance with the communication protocol the parties had established and with Madison's consent. 3 lines. No photograph. No medical details beyond the fact that Madison and the child were stable. No photo session. No post. Not a single line in any media campaign by any organization. The entire Hope Lives at Nova Life campaign was removed from Nova Life's platforms during the first week after the preliminary findings report was issued, and the independent committee suspended the related media activity. It was never replaced with any other campaign featuring Madison or the child. The court issued a protective order in August. Every public filing had to use initials instead of the child's name. Exhibits containing identifying information, genetic data, and medical records were filed under seal. Limited testing was performed by an independent laboratory under court order, with Madison's attorney participating, solely to determine the genetic relationship necessary for the investigation. Those results were also sealed. I opposed none of it. On the contrary, most of those protections were included in the motion Maya filed on my behalf. This is the part I need to state very clearly, because it is the first question people always ask me. I did not ask the court to establish me as the legal parent. I did not seek custody, not because Maya ordered me to give it up, and not because the court decided for me. I sat with that question for months, and finally understood what I believe is the most important point in this entire story. That child was not what had been taken from me. What had been taken was my right to know and my right to consent. That was what Ethan stole. If I now entered a newborn child's life and declared that a genetic relationship gave me the right to change that child's entire future, I would still be turning a human being into something transferable through documents. I did not want to win by becoming his version of me. So Maya included 3 requests in the motion for a protective order. After hearing from Madison's counsel and other interested parties, the court granted all 3 to the extent permitted by law. First, an accurate record of the genetic relationship had to be preserved in a sealed court exhibit, and with an independent medical custodian appointed by the court. Not for my benefit, but because one day that child might need access to their own medical history. No adult had the right to erase that information from the child's life for convenience. Second, I was allowed to write a letter. The letter would be kept with the sealed exhibit under a court-approved arrangement. When old enough, the child could request access if that person chose to do so. No one would automatically send the letter. No one could use it to force a relationship. It took me 3 weeks to write it. It was exactly 1 page. In it, I did not say I was that child's mother. I did not say I loved the child because I did not want to place on a stranger the obligation to return my feelings. I only explained in the simplest language I could what happened, why it happened, and that none of it was the child's fault. I ended with 1 sentence. If you never want to know anything more, that is also a completely valid choice, and no one has the right to tell you otherwise. Third, The child's name, image, and identifying information could not be used in public filings, media materials, or unnecessary portions of the dispute. When limited information was legally required, it had to be redacted, replaced with initials, or filed in a sealed exhibit. Madison cooperated through her own attorney within the agreed scope. She acknowledged that she knew she had undergone an embryo transfer. She acknowledged that she had not requested the source records and had accepted Ethan's explanation that it was a donated embryo whose use had been validly transferred. She also acknowledged that she knew the media campaign's description of the pregnancy as a completely natural surprise was untrue, but still signed the release allowing her image and that story to be used. After screening for privilege, medical records, and unrelated data, Madison's attorney produced communications between her and Ethan that fell within the lawful request. Madison gave sworn testimony about what Ethan told her, the form she was given to sign, and Dr. Victor Sloan's role in the treatment process. Dr. Sloan's authority to practice at Nova Life and supervise its laboratory remained suspended. The state medical board opened a separate proceeding and imposed temporary restrictions during its investigation. A grand jury indicted Ethan in September. The indictment did not include any charge called embryo theft. Prosecutors had to use existing offenses that matched the conduct they believed they could prove. The charges included conduct related to wire fraud in the transaction, unlawful use of identifying information, conspiracy, record falsification or interference, and obstruction of evidence preservation and review. None of those charges fully described what had actually been taken from me. Nora Kim testified at a preliminary hearing in late September. She testified about process, how an exception report was created, what she observed in the lab that morning, and how her report was closed. She offered no speculation about anyone's motive. She described only what she saw and what standard procedure required. We still had never met. By order of the judge, I was permitted to sit in the victim area of the courtroom on the day Nora testified, about 15 meters from where she stood. At the end of her testimony, she passed my row on her way out. We looked at each other for about 1 second. She gave a slight nod. I nodded back. That was everything that ever passed between us after that. One October afternoon, Maya called while I was driving home from the office. "There is something I need to update you on," she said. "C18. I pulled to the side of the road. "It is still secure," Maya said. The storage custodian just filed a periodic inventory certification under seal. C18's location, storage temperature, and status have all been confirmed. C18 remains subject to the court's status quo order. Ordinary delete and overwrite privileges affecting the related data have been disabled. Every remaining privileged access is logged and independently monitored. I exhaled. "There is one more thing," she continued. "The court has separated C18's future from the criminal case and placed it in a separate sealed civil proceeding, coordinated with the remaining divorce issues when necessary. No party may move, use, destroy, or alter C18's status without valid consent or a new court order." Rachel, I want you to hear this part clearly. "I'm listening." "You do not have to sign anything now," Maya said. "There is no immediate deadline forcing you to decide while the status quo order remains in effect. No one is waiting for a verification code from you. No one is permitted to decide for you. For 5 years, every time you faced a decision about your body, someone stood beside you urging you to sign. Not this time." I sat in the car for a long time after the call, watching traffic move along the highway. It was the first time in 6 years that a decision involving my ability to become a mother was not being forced out of me with a verification code, a signature, or a ticking clock. 2 years passed after the day at the convention center. Ethan went to trial in a proceeding that lasted 9 days. I testified for 1 day under subpoena and chose to attend 3 additional days after the judge allowed it. I did not remain to hear the jury announce its verdict. Maya called that evening and read the result over the phone while I washed dishes in the kitchen. Ethan was convicted on most of the material charges. I remember thinking I would feel something enormous in that moment, but all I felt was a very deep quiet, like a noise that had continued for years had finally stopped, and only then did I realize it had been there the entire time. Sentencing took place several months later. I submitted a victim impact statement, but did not attend in person. Maya called after the hearing and told me the sentence. Dr. Victor Sloan reached a plea agreement in the criminal case. In a separate disciplinary proceeding, the medical board allowed him to keep a conditional license, but permanently prohibited him from managing a fertility facility, supervising a laboratory, or participating in decisions involving embryos and gametes. I remained angry for weeks before accepting that the system had never been designed to satisfy me. Judith Morgan was not prosecuted for anything. There was not enough evidence to prove that she knew about or participated in the forged consent, data changes, or transfer of C-17. She had only sat at the head of the dinner table for 5 years and released sentences designed to make other people feel smaller. Her role as honorary chair of the Nova Life Family Foundation simply was not renewed when her term expired. Madison Cole left healthcare administration. She lived privately in another state. We did not communicate, and I do not think we ever will. Any necessary communication, if there is any, goes through attorneys and the court. After months of review, the buyers and sellers independent committee signed an amended agreement. Hale Reproductive Holdings completed its acquisition of Nova Life Management Services, the management platform, non-clinical assets, and contracts supporting 7 facilities at an adjusted price and under a revised escrow structure. Nova Life Reproductive Medical Group remained a separate clinical entity. Hale did not purchase embryos, gametes, treatment decision rights, or unrestricted ownership of patient records. Ethan did not receive the $9,600,000 he had expected. That interest was removed from the amended payment structure, and related funds remained held to address claims and resulting obligations. I received a civil settlement the following spring. That money came from a separate agreement, not the criminal judgment. The settlement did not require me to waive my right to cooperate with courts, regulators, or investigators. I need to make this clear, because this is where my story differs from what people often imagine. I did not become rich overnight. After 2 years of legal fees, forensic expenses, medical costs, and financial obligations identified by my tax advisor, the money left was enough to pay the debt I had accumulated while suspended from work, purchase a small house, and leave a remainder I considered for a long time. I used most of what remained to establish a patient support fund, not a charity that granted scholarships or paid for treatment. The fund did exactly one thing. It paid legal and forensic expenses for patients who had credible signs of record discrepancies, had been denied lawful access, or needed independent experts to explain data they received, but could not afford the assistance. Because I understood better than anyone that if I had not had enough separate money to pay initial legal fees, and if I had not had a small house in my own name where I could shelter, this entire story would have ended in the second month. Meanwhile, Nova Life Management Services' new leadership spent 18 months restructuring the governance and technology platform supporting the 7 facilities. Nova Life Reproductive Medical Group implemented a separate clinical remediation program under the oversight of the accrediting body and regulators. Lucas supported the reform principles as a shareholder, but did not direct day-to-day implementation and did not participate in handling any record related to me. No one called it reform. In internal documents, it was given its precise technical name, Closing Process Control Gaps. From then on, decisions concerning embryo use, transfer, or disposition had to be independently confirmed by every person entitled to decide through that person's registered channel. Exceptions could be processed only under a court order or separately verified legal representative authority. If a device or contact number changed, the system required enhanced identity verification, imposed a waiting period, and sent an alert to the old channel before activating the new one. Every contact information change generated alerts through the patient portal and all still active verified channels. New contact information could not immediately be used for a critical decision during the waiting period. Specimen release and transfer had to be confirmed by 2 people with separate authority or by 1 authorized person together with a validated electronic witnessing system. No one could create an order and then confirm that same order personally. System logs were converted to an append-only tamper-resistant format, stored in a segregated environment. Every privileged administrative action created an independent trail the user could not delete. And every facility had an independent patient counsel. The council received periodic de-identified compliance reports and could submit questions directly to the audit committee. After conflict checks were completed, the new leadership once invited me to serve in an advisory role. Lucas did not participate in the hiring decision. They asked once and did not ask again after I declined. I did not want to work for an organization whose ownership was controlled by the man I was living with. I had spent 8 years in a marriage where the line between family and work had been erased so completely that a husband could approve the cost of his own wife's treatment and no one saw a problem. Instead, I led a separate organization focused on data integrity and consent procedures in reproductive medicine, with an independent board, diverse funding, and no ownership connection to Hale Reproductive Holdings. The organization's review agreements protected the right to publish aggregated results, including adverse findings, after removing identifying information and allowing the reviewed facility an opportunity to respond. We had published adverse findings about a facility in the network supported by Novalife Management Services. Lucas did not participate in selecting the facility, defining the review scope, or responding to the findings. We married in the fall of the second year. Not because it was time, but because we had lived together long enough for me to know with certainty that I wanted it, and because I had completed almost 2 years of therapy before answering that question. I need to talk about the therapy because it was the hardest part and the part least often told. During those 2 years, I worked with a therapist who specialized in trauma caused by prolonged psychological manipulation. What I had to relearn was not how to trust other people. It was how to trust myself. For 5 years, I had been systematically trained to believe that whenever my perception conflicted with what someone else said, I was always the part that was wrong. Undoing that took longer than building the entire legal case. When we decided to have children, the question of C-18 appeared almost immediately. The sealed civil proceeding ended with C-18 continuing in storage. No party could use, move, or destroy C-18 without valid agreement or a new court order. I had the right to choose whether to continue seeking use of C-18, but I was not required to decide. I thought about it for months, and finally I realized that my strongest motivation at the time was not the desire to welcome a child. I wanted to prove something. To prove I had finally saved what they intended to destroy. To prove my 5 years had not been meaningless. To prove Ethan was wrong. No child should have to carry that weight of symbolism from the first moment of life. So I did not continue seeking use of C-18. C-18 remained stored under proper conditions, while the court order and storage agreement remained effective. Every future decision had to proceed through the established civil process. Perhaps one day I will make a different choice. Perhaps never. What mattered was that no one stood beside me urging me to sign anything. We created new embryos at a completely independent facility in another state, outside Lucas's network and with no contractual relationship to his company. I said that was the only way I could continue treatment. Lucas agreed immediately because it was my medical and ethical boundary, not a test for him. I received every portion of the record to which I was lawfully entitled. Consent forms, embryo grading sheets, laboratory notes, witnessing records, and a chain of custody extract with third-party information removed. I entered every verification code myself on my own device. The physician explained every option fully, but we chose to transfer exactly one embryo. After everything my body had endured, I did not want to accept any unnecessary additional risk. The first ultrasound took place on a Tuesday morning at 7 weeks. I lay on the table. Lucas sat beside me. The technician moved the probe in silence longer than I expected. Then she stopped. "Ms. Morgan," she said, still looking at the screen, "you transferred one embryo, correct?" "Correct," I said. She saved several images and said the physician would come in to review them before explaining the result. About 2 minutes later, the physician entered the room. She reviewed the images, adjusted the probe, and turned the monitor toward us. Two small embryos appeared side by side. The physician pointed to the screen. "I see two embryos," she said. "The images are consistent with the transferred embryo splitting into a pair of identical twins." The two girls were born on a March morning in the third year after the convention center event. Lucas and I had begun treatment before our wedding in the fall of the second year. We did not delay or accelerate treatment to fit a chosen wedding date. They were identical twins, developing from a single embryo that divided at an early stage, a phenomenon the physician explained to me through percentages and biological mechanisms, not with the word miracle. I was grateful for that. I had spent enough years listening to other people tell beautiful stories about my body. The pregnancy was managed by a high-risk obstetrician and a maternal fetal medicine team, entirely independent of Lucas's specialty and work. It was not a perfect pregnancy. I developed gestational diabetes at 26 weeks and checked my blood sugar 4 times a day. I spent one night in the hospital at 31 weeks because of early contractions. Both babies were born at 36 weeks, earlier than expected, and spent 4 days in the neonatal intensive care unit before coming home with me. It was a twin pregnancy in a woman in her late 30s, closely monitored with real risks, manageable complications, and periods of worry that did not need to become symbols. I do not want to tell it any other way. Lucas attended the important appointments and most monitoring visits that his work schedule allowed. He understood many of the measures involved in assisted reproduction, but did not pretend his expertise could replace the obstetrician or maternal fetal medicine specialist. He never once offered a professional opinion in the clinic unless the treating physician directly asked him. He also never requested separate access to my records or spoke with any doctor behind my back. Once, at 28 weeks, the physician proposed 2 different monitoring options and asked whether I needed anything clarified. I turned to Lucas. He looked at me and said, "Rachel, ask the doctor everything you need to know. The final decision is yours." Later, when we reached the car, I asked what he thought about the 2 options. He answered in detail for 15 minutes and ended with, "But that is the opinion of someone reading the numbers, not the person carrying the pregnancy and directly bearing the risk." I continued my work at the Patient Consent Integrity Foundation. It was the independent organization I founded to study data integrity and consent procedures in reproductive medicine. The legal and forensic support fund I had established earlier became a program within the organization, with its own budget and review board. The organization now employed 14 people and operated in 7 states. We assisted 4 groups, people who discovered that their signatures might have been forged during reproductive treatment, patients whose contact information had been changed without notice, families with credible grounds to request a chain of custody review of biological specimens, and healthcare workers who wanted to report misconduct but feared losing their jobs. We did not access hospital records on our own and did not replace patients' attorneys. We funded independent experts, provided guidance on record request procedures, connected people needing help with their own lawyers, and helped preserve data through lawful channels. The 4th group mattered most to me because I knew exactly what Nora Kim had paid for refusing to remain silent. She opened the exception report. She sent the warning to compliance. She refused to continue a process she believed was not valid. And the organization where she worked tried to turn all of it into a data entry error. The network that once operated under the Nova Life name now used a new brand. The new name was not used to erase the past. The public remediation report still stated clearly that the system had operated as Nova Life, while historical records retained the original legal entities, dates, and audit trails. The non-clinical management platform and the clinical network used the new brand together, but the former Nova Life Management Services and Nova Life Reproductive Medical Group were succeeded by entities with separate responsibilities. The management entity handled technology, finance, and support contracts. The clinical entity remained responsible for treatment, laboratories, embryos, gametes, and patient records. Nora Kim was now Director of Laboratory Quality Assurance for the medical group. Administratively, she worked with clinical leadership. In her control function, she had direct, unmediated reporting authority to the Independent Quality Committee. If Nora opened an exception report today, no single medical director could close it alone. Closure required two independent approvals, a written reason, and an audit trail the approvers could not delete from the segregated storage environment. We still had never spoken. I think both of us understood that was right. The competent authorities completed their review of the 17 flagged records, including mine. Patients requiring notice were contacted directly and privately. Purely administrative discrepancies were separated from cases requiring remediation, discipline, or deeper legal review. No individual result was made public. I do not know the names of the other patients. I do not need to know. C-18 remained in storage. C-18 remained subject to the court order and the established seal civil process. No one could decide for me. But I also could not unilaterally use, move, or destroy C-18 outside that process. Every privileged action involving it created an independent trace in the segregated storage environment and remained subject to oversight. I still had not renewed any request to use C-18, and I had stopped feeling pressure to decide. Some evenings I thought about it. Some months I did not think about it once. That was something I had once believed impossible, living beside an unanswered question without needing to answer it immediately. The sealed letter had been in the court file for more than 2 years. The child Madison gave birth to was now more than 2 years old. I did not know the name. I did not know what the child looked like. I did not know where the child lived, and I did not investigate. I had never asked to open the exhibit containing identifying information. Maya once said the court could consider my access rights if a legally necessary reason arose someday. But my curiosity was not a reason to cross a child's privacy boundary. In that letter, I did not demand to be called mother. I did not ask the child to forgive, hate, or judge any adult. I left only 3 things. First, an explanation that the official medical record of the genetic relationship had been preserved separately by the court and the medical custodian, so that one day the child could access their own health history if necessary. I did not interpret those results in the letter. Second, a brief explanation of what happened among the adults, using language that did not hide the fact that my consent had not been authenticated. Third, an assurance that no part of it was the child's responsibility. The child was not responsible for the circumstances of birth. No child ever is. One evening, about 3 months after my twins were born, I sat on the living room floor close to 2 in the morning while both babies cried at once, my hair stuck to my forehead and my body exhausted, while Lucas struggled to warm bottles in the kitchen. And in that very ordinary moment, I thought about Madison. Not with hatred. Not with forgiveness either, because I am not sure I ever forgave her. I only realized something it had taken me almost 3 years to understand. For many months of that first year, part of me believed victory meant finally having what I once thought Madison had: a child, a family, a life Ethan had tried to take from me. I had looked at her as though she were living in the future that should have belonged to me. I had believed that if I could become a mother, it would mean Ethan was wrong and everything would be balanced. But sitting on the floor at 2 in the morning, I understood that was not victory. The 2 crying children in front of me were not replacements for C-17. They were not compensation for 5 years of treatment. They were not proof that I was worth more than Madison. And they were not a prize for defeating Ethan. Victory was not that I had children. If I had been unable to have children, or had chosen not to, everything I did during those years would have been just as right. The forensic report would still exist. The review of the 17 records, including mine, would still have to be completed. Nora would still have to be protected. The system would still have to change. Victory was having the right to choose, and no one could ever again use my identity to say yes for me. There are 3 things I took from everything that happened, and I share them with every patient group my organization works with. First, trust is not a system. My mistake was not that I trusted my husband. No one is responsible for being betrayed simply because they trusted someone they loved. Nova Life's mistake was building a system that turned that trust into access, authentication, and decision-making authority without independent verification. Even if I had read every document provided to me, the patient export still did not include the intermediate statuses, back-end logs, or exception reports that had been closed. A real system must protect people even when the person with power inside it is no longer honest. If your safety depends on everyone around you remaining good, you do not have a safe system. Second, calm is not weakness. For 6 months, I never shouted at Ethan once, and some days that felt like cowardice. But I was not silent. I contacted Maya. I sent a preservation demand. I sought a court order. I worked with experts before publicly confronting people who still had access to the data. I was not quiet because I surrendered. I acted carefully enough for the truth to be preserved in a form that could be proven. If I had alerted the people with access before the data was locked, they might have had an opportunity to alter or erase more of the trail. That was the right choice for my circumstances. It is not a rule requiring any victim to remain silent when in danger. Third, justice is not turning a child into a trophy. Justice means holding adults accountable without passing the consequences of their actions onto a life that had no choice. Justice also does not require a child to become evidence, compensation, or a bridge between adults. Ethan once used my identity and a signature that could not be authenticated as mine to decide which embryo would be used, who would receive it, and when, without my consent. Almost 3 years later, I stood in a room filled with the cries of 2 children and understood that what I had reclaimed was not only the chance to become a mother. I had reclaimed the right to say yes, to say no, to choose whether to continue treatment, and to decide what was allowed to happen to my body. I looked down into the yard at Oliver, the child an entire network of adults had tried to turn into a tool for their ambitions, only to discover in the end that the people who seem most distant by blood were the ones who stayed until the very end. Blood alone is not enough to make a family. Family is created by choices repeated every day. Who stays when everything collapses? Who protects the vulnerable without demanding a benefit? Who takes responsibility for the harm they caused? And who has the courage to leave relationships that survive only through one-sided sacrifice? Because in the end, family is not necessarily made up of people who share your blood. It is made up of the people who choose to love, protect, and stay.